I sat in the corner of a $20 million dining room watching my son-in-law try to impress men who owned half of Atlanta. He snapped his fingers at me like I was the hired help, ordering me to pour his whiskey. When I looked him dead in the eye and told him to pour it himself, he did not just get mad. He threw his heavy crystal glass right at my boots. The room went dead silent as blood soaked through my sock. I did not yell. I just walked out into the cold rain. He thought he had broken a week-old man that night. He had no idea he had just handed me the shovel to dig his own grave. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to someone who underestimated your worth. The air in that dining room was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of expensive cologne roasted lamb and absolute desperation. Bradley, my son-in-law, had been sweating through his custom-tailored suit all evening. He was hosting 3 venture capitalists from New York men who moved millions of dollars before they even had their morning coffee. Bradley needed their money for some massive real estate development he was trying to get off the ground. He had been laughing too loud, agreeing with everything they said, and trying to project the image of a powerful, fearless CEO. I was 74 years old. I had spent 40 years of my life working as a master electrician, wiring the industrial backbone of Georgia with my bare hands. I knew what real work looked like. I knew what a real man looked like. And Bradley was not it. He was a hollow suit built on credit and arrogance. I was only there because my daughter Maya had begged me to come. She said Bradley wanted to show the investors that they were a wholesome family grounded in traditional values. I knew it was nonsense, but I went for her. I sat quietly at the end of the massive mahogany table, keeping my thoughts to myself. I ate the food, I drank the water, and I watched. I watched how Bradley constantly interrupted Maya when she tried to speak. I watched how he treated the catering staff like they were invisible. He was a man who desperately needed to feel superior to everyone in the room. As the dinner wound down and the plates were cleared, Bradley pulled out a bottle of 50-year-old Macallan Scotch. He poured generous glasses for the 3 investors, laughing at some joke one of them made. Then he looked down the table at me. His eyes were glassy. He wanted to show these wealthy white men that he was the absolute king of his castle. He pointed at the bottle, then pointed at me, and actually snapped his fingers. "Hey, Roland," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Be a good guy and top off my glass, will you?" He slid his empty crystal tumbler across the polished wood. It stopped a few inches from my plate. The 3 investors paused their conversation and looked over. They were waiting to see what the old black man would do. They expected me to nod, smile, and play the obedient father-in-law. I looked at the glass. Then I looked at Bradley. My hands were calloused, scarred from decades of pulling copper wire through steel conduits. I had built my own house, I had bought my own land, and I had never bowed my head to a man who had not earned my respect. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch out. "Pour it yourself, Bradley," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried through that massive room like a gunshot. I kept my eyes locked on his, not blinking, not shifting in my seat. The air instantly left the room. One of the investors cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his leather chair. I saw the exact moment Bradley's fragile ego shattered. The color drained from his face and then rushed back in a violent crimson tide. The veins in his neck popped. He hated looking weak. He hated being challenged, especially in his own home and especially by me. He could not handle the embarrassment. His breathing grew heavy and his eyes turned wild. He did not say a word. He just reached out, grabbed the heavy crystal tumbler he had just slid toward me and hurled it with all his strength. The glass flew across the length of the table and smashed into the floor right at my work boots. The sound of the explosion echoed off the 20-foot ceilings. Sharp, thick shards of crystal sprayed everywhere. A jagged piece sliced right through the thick denim of my jeans and bit deep into my ankle. A sharp, burning pain shot up my leg. I looked down. Dark red blood was already pooling around the sole of my leather boot, staining the expensive Persian rug beneath my feet. The entire room froze. The investors were staring wide-eyed in pure shock. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Everyone expected me to react. They expected me to jump up to scream, to curse him out, or to launch myself across the table and wrap my hands around his throat. But you do not survive working with high voltage lines by losing your temper when a circuit blows. You survive by staying absolutely still and calculating the exact point of failure. I did not flinch. I did not grab my leg. I slowly lifted my head and looked at Bradley. He was standing now, his chest heaving, his fists clenched, looking like a cornered animal, realizing he had just made a massive mistake. He was waiting for my retaliation. I did not give him the satisfaction of my anger. Instead, I turned my head and looked at my daughter. Maya was sitting just a few feet away from him. She had not made a sound when the glass shattered. She had not jumped up to check on me. She was sitting frozen, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling in her lap. She was staring down at her untouched dessert, avoiding my gaze entirely. She was terrified. In that brief, suffocating moment, the truth hit me harder than the glass ever could. My daughter was a hostage in her own home. She was so beaten down by his psychological abuse, so paralyzed by fear, that she could not even speak up when her own husband drew her father's blood. Seeing her like that broke my heart, but it also flipped a switch deep inside my mind. I realized that arguing with a man like Bradley was a waste of breath. You do not argue with a rabid dog, you simply put it down. I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. I stood up slowly, feeling the warm blood trickling down my heel. I did not bother to brush the fragments of crystal off my jeans. I did not say a single word to Bradley, to the investors, or even to Maya. I just turned around and walked toward the grand foyer. My heavy boots crunched over the broken glass with every step. I grabbed my old canvas coat from the brass coat rack. Bradley did not try to stop me. He stood there paralyzed by his own reckless stupidity. I pushed open the heavy oak front doors and stepped out into the night. A cold, driving Georgia rain was washing over the massive driveway. The icy water hit my face, mixing with the anger that was finally beginning to boil in my chest. I limped past his row of luxury cars and climbed into my battered Ford pickup truck. I slammed the door shut, shutting out the noise of the storm. I reached down into my glove compartment, pulled out a clean shop rag, and tied it tight around my bleeding ankle. It hurt, but physical pain was something I was used to. It was the easiest kind of pain to ignore. I started the engine and turned on the heater. I sat there in the dark driveway watching the lights of that massive fake mansion glowing through the rain. Bradley thought he had established dominance tonight. He thought he had put me in my place. He thought I was just a tired old man who would go home, lick his wounds, and stay out of his way. He did not know that by throwing that glass, he had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. It was past midnight, but I knew the man I needed to call would be awake. The rules of engagement had just changed. I was not going to yell. I was not going to fight him with my fists. I was going to take everything he had. I dialed the number, pressed the phone to my ear, and listened to it ring as the rain hammered against my windshield. The morning sun did nothing to warm the damp chill that had settled into my bones overnight. I had parked my truck in the back lot of a 24-hour diner, letting the engine run every few hours just to keep the frost off the windshield. My ankle throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. The shop rag I had tied around it was stiff with dried blood, but the bleeding had stopped. At exactly 8 in the morning, I walked through the glass doors of my local bank branch. It was a place I had trusted for 30 years. I knew the tellers by name. I knew their families and asked about their kids. I just needed enough cash to get a clean hotel room and a hot shower before I figured out my next move. I needed that money to feel like a human being again. I stepped up to the counter and smiled at Sarah, a young woman who usually greeted me with a bright morning. Today, however, she did not smile back. She looked down at her keyboard and avoided making eye contact. I slid my worn debit card across the polished counter and asked to withdraw $500. Sarah took the card with trembling fingers. She swiped it through her machine and waited. A small red light blinked on her screen. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the glass office in the back. She swiped it a second time. The same red light flashed. "Mr. Rowland," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. "I am so sorry, but your card is showing up as restricted." I frowned, leaning a little closer. I told her there must be some kind of mistake because I had over $80,000 sitting in that checking account from my pension and my contracting business. I asked her to run it again or check the system for a glitch. Sarah shook her head, her face turning pale. She slid the card back across the counter as if it burned her fingers. "I cannot do that, sir," she said quietly. "The system says your accounts have been completely frozen. I am not even supposed to discuss the details with you." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. A man does not work his entire life building a safety net just to have it vanish overnight. I told her calmly that I was not leaving without my money. Sarah looked terrified and quickly hit a button under her desk, signaling for the branch manager. The branch manager was a man named David. I had known him since he was a junior loan officer. He stepped out of his glass office holding a thick manila folder. He did not extend his hand to greet me. Instead, he gestured toward his open door, asking me to step inside where we could have a private conversation. I limped into his office and sat down heavily in the leather chair across from his desk. David closed the blinds. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and extreme caution. He sat down and opened the folder, revealing a stack of legal documents stamped with official court seals. "Roland," he began, his voice low and practiced, "I received a frantic phone call at 2 in the morning from your son-in-law, Bradley. He submitted an emergency electronic filing with the state. I asked David what kind of filing could possibly freeze the money I had earned with my own sweat." David sighed and pushed a piece of paper across the desk. It was a medical power of attorney. My eyes scanned the heavy black text. According to this document, Bradley had petitioned a judge in the middle of the night claiming I had suffered a violent and severe dementia episode during a family dinner. The document stated that I had become dangerously unhinged, that I had shattered glass, destroyed property, and presented an immediate physical threat to myself and my family. He filed sworn affidavits from 3 wealthy investors claiming they witnessed my mental collapse. I sat there listening to the sheer audacity of the lie. The sheer evil of his plan was breathtaking. He had planned this long before the dinner. Bradley had taken the exact moment he assaulted me and twisted it into a weapon to strip away my financial independence. He used his wealthy friends as witnesses to corroborate his fabricated story. David explained that because of my advanced age and the sworn testimony, the judge had granted a temporary emergency injunction. Bradley was now my legal guardian. Every penny I owned, every savings account, every retirement fund, and every credit card was now under his direct legal control. I could not buy a cup of coffee without his explicit permission. I looked David in the eye and asked him if he honestly believed I was out of my mind. I asked him if the man sitting across from him sounded like a crazy person. David looked down at his hands, unable to meet my gaze. He whispered that his personal opinion did not matter anymore. The bank had to follow the court order. If he gave me a single dollar, he would be breaking the law. He told me that Bradley had instructed the bank to call the police if I caused a disturbance. Bradley had anticipated that I would come here for money, and he had laid a trap to prove his point. If I got angry, if I raised my voice, they would arrest me, and it would only confirm his lies about my mental state. I realized then the true scale of Bradley and his terrifying trap. I walked out of the bank with nothing but the clothes on my back and my truck keys in my pocket. I climbed into the cab of my truck, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the sheer precision of the betrayal. I pulled out my phone and dialed my daughter. Maya answered on the first ring. She was already crying. Her sobs were loud and desperate, echoing through the tiny speaker. Before I could even ask her how she could let this happen, she started begging for my forgiveness. I could hear the absolute terror in her voice. She was completely broken by his psychological warfare. She told me that after I left the house, Bradley had locked the bedroom door. He had shoved the legal papers in her face and demanded she sign her name as the primary family witness to my supposed mental decline. I asked her why she would ever put her name on a lie like that. Maya choked back a sob and confessed the brutal truth. Bradley had threatened to destroy her entirely if she refused. He told her his business was quietly failing and he was drowning in massive hidden debts. If she did not help him steal my assets to save his company, he promised to file for divorce the very next morning. He threatened to use his high-priced lawyers to take full custody of her 2 young children. He told her he would leave her completely penniless, buried under a mountain of his corporate debt, with no way to ever see her babies again. Maya was trapped in a financial and emotional prison. She chose her children over her father. I listened to her cry, feeling a deep, heavy sorrow for the frightened woman my little girl had become. I told Maya not to cry anymore. I told her I understood, and I hung up the phone without another word. I sat in the silent truck and stared out at the busy street. The gravity of the situation settled over me like a heavy lead blanket. It was a terrifying realization. I was 74 years old, D4. I had worked tirelessly since I was a teenager. I had followed the rules, paid my taxes, and built a life of total independence. And in the span of 8 hours, all of it had been legally erased. My money was gone. My rights were gone. My own name was now a liability. In the eyes of the law, I was a helpless, confused old man who needed a wealthy white savior to manage his life. Bradley had weaponized the justice system against me with ruthless efficiency. He assumed that because I was old and broke, I would just roll over and accept my fate. He thought I would end up in some state-run facility medicated and forgotten while he spent my hard-earned money to save his fraudulent empire. I looked down at my hands. They were empty. I had no cash to buy food. I had no way to pay for gas. I was effectively a homeless man standing on the pavement of a city I had helped build. But Bradley had made one catastrophic miscalculation. I had survived worse things in my life than a spoiled rich kid playing with legal papers. He had stripped away my comfort, but he had not touched my mind. He had taken away my resources, but he had forgotten my resilience. I turned the key in the ignition, listening to the engine roar to life. The game had just begun. I left the diner parking lot and started walking. I had no money for a cab and my truck was running on fumes, so I left it behind. I had a 50-acre property sitting just outside the city limits. It was the land my late wife Beatrice and I bought over 40 years ago when it was nothing but wild brush and Georgia clay. I cleared that land with my own hands. I built the farmhouse frame by frame. Every oak tree on that property held a memory of my life before the world turned cold. I figured if I was going to fight this battle, I needed to do it from my own front porch. The walk took me 2 hours. My ankle was still wrapped in that stiff, bloody shop rag, screaming with every step I took along the asphalt shoulder of the highway. The morning air was thick with humidity, making it hard to breathe, but I kept my pace steady. I did not let the pain stop me. I focused on the rhythm of my boots hitting the gravel. Finally, the familiar wrought iron gates of my driveway came into view. But something was entirely wrong. My heart sank as I got closer. The heavy iron gates were chained shut with a thick industrial padlock. Parked right across the entrance was a black vehicle with tinted windows. 2 men in tactical vests and heavy boots were standing outside, leaning against the hood. They were private security contractors. They had radios clipped to their shoulders, and their hands rested casually near their belts. I stopped a few feet away from the gate. The taller guard stepped forward, holding his hand up. He looked me up and down, taking in my blood-stained jeans and worn-out coat. He did not see a landowner. He saw an old vagrant. He told me I was trespassing on private corporate property and ordered me to turn around. I told him my name was Roland and that I owned every blade of grass behind that fence. I told him to open the gate. The guard just smirked and shook his head. He told me there was no Roland on the deed anymore. He tapped his radio and said the property belonged to a new management group. Before I could speak, I heard a loud engine approaching. I turned to look. A sleek silver Porsche flew down the country road, kicking up a massive cloud of yellow dust. The sports car came to a sudden screeching halt right behind me. The driver door swung open and Bradley stepped out. He was wearing an expensive designer suit, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of the rural Georgia landscape. He did not look angry anymore. He looked incredibly pleased with himself. He leaned against the expensive leather interior of his car and adjusted his sunglasses, giving me a wide, arrogant smile. He walked toward me with the slow, confident swagger of a man who believed he had already won the war. He stopped just a few feet away, keeping a safe distance behind the 2 armed security guards. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. He did not hand it to me directly. Instead, he tossed it onto the gravel at my feet. He told me that envelope contained a formal legal eviction notice. He gloated that my time as a property owner was officially over. I stood completely still, refusing to look down at the papers in the dirt. I stared directly into his eyes and asked him how he managed to steal my land overnight. Bradley laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed off the trees. He explained that since he was now my legal guardian under the emergency medical power of attorney, he had the absolute right to manage my assets for my own protection. He said that a confused, unstable old man like me could not possibly handle the responsibilities of maintaining a 50-acre estate. Therefore, he had generously transferred the entire property deed into his own corporate holding company. He told me he was doing me a massive favor by taking this burden off my shoulders. He stood there soaking in his own perceived brilliance, believing he had orchestrated the perfect crime. He told me that my signature was worthless now, and that his signature was the only one that mattered to the state. He sneered as he said that I no longer existed in the eyes of the law. I was legally incompetent, a ghost in my own life. He had systematically stripped away my dignity, my money, and now my home. He looked at my bloody ankle and mocked me, asking if I needed him to call an ambulance for my pathetic condition. He said he would hate for me to collapse on his beautiful new property. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to curse him out and throw a punch so he could have his guards beat me down. He craved the satisfaction of seeing me completely broken and humiliated in front of his hired muscle. I did not give him what he wanted. I just looked at him, feeling a deep, cold wave of pity for the fool standing in front of me. He had no idea what he had just done. And smiled. Bradley paced back and forth across the gravel, waving his hands like a theater actor performing for an audience of one. He was eager to brag about his master plan. He pointed a manicured finger toward the dense tree line beyond the farmhouse. He told me he was tired of looking at my useless dirt and rotting timber. He proudly revealed that he had already secured the financing to build a $100 million luxury eco-resort right on top of my land. He described his vision with nauseating enthusiasm. He talked about tearing down the house I had built for my wife to make way for a grand lobby. He talked about paving over her flower gardens to lay down a massive heated infinity pool. He said his wealthy investors were absolutely thrilled to have secured such a pristine piece of untouched rural property so close to the city. I listened to him detail his grand design, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me. He puffed out his chest and announced that tomorrow morning at the crack of dawn, a fleet of heavy bulldozers and massive excavators would be rolling through these gates. He told me his crews were going to rip up the soil, level the hills, and completely sanitize the entire 50 acres. He wanted to wipe every trace of my existence off the map. He turned to the two security guards standing at attention by the gate. He pointed at me and gave them a strict, aggressive order. He told them that I was a dangerous, unstable trespasser. He instructed the guards to tackle me to the ground, put me in zip ties, and call the police if my boots so much as touched a single blade of his grass. He made sure to speak loudly enough so I would hear every threatening word. He turned back to me with a vicious, mocking grin. He asked me if I understood the new rules of his kingdom. He warned me that if I tried to play the hero and stop his demolition crews, he would make sure the judge locked me away in a padded cell for the rest of my miserable life. He stood there, blocking the entrance to my own home, daring me to cross the line. He waited for the fear to show in my weary old brown eyes right now. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with his madness. I simply looked at the heavy machinery tracks already printed in the mud near the gate. I pictured the massive excavators digging their steel teeth deep into the Georgia soil exactly where he told them to dig. I slowly lifted my head, making direct eye contact with my arrogant son-in-law. I gave him a single slow nod of acknowledgement. Then, without uttering a single word, I turned my back on him. I began walking slowly away down the empty stretch of county highway. I did not look over my shoulder even once. The reaction completely broke his script. Bradley shouted after me, demanding to know where I was going. He was deeply confused and visibly frustrated by my total lack of resistance. He wanted a war, and I had just handed him a bloodless surrender. He could not understand why a man would walk away from his life savings without throwing a single punch. As I limped away into the afternoon heat, I smiled. He was so incredibly eager to break his ground, and I sincerely hoped he would dig deep. The afternoon sun beat down on my shoulders as I walked along the dusty shoulder of the county highway. I had made it about a mile from my own front gate when a white, unmarked van pulled up slowly behind me. The engine hummed with a low rattle as it kept pace with my limp. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, listening to the tires crunch on the loose gravel. Suddenly, the van accelerated and swerved, cutting me off and blocking the narrow path. The side door slid open with a loud metallic scrape. Two large men stepped out onto the dirt. They were dressed in cheap blue scrubs that stretched tight across their broad chests. They did not look like medical professionals. They looked like bouncers hired from a cheap nightclub. The driver, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and cold eyes, pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. He held it up and told me his name was Marcus, and he was here to execute a medical transport order, authorized by my legal guardian, Bradley Pierce. He said they were taking me to a secure facility for my own safety and psychological evaluation. I stopped walking and looked at the two men. I told them I was perfectly fine and that I was just taking a walk. The second man stepped closer, cracking his knuckles. He smiled a cruel, joyless smile and told me I could either get in the back of the van voluntarily or they could put me in the back of the van themselves. He said Bradley had warned them I might become violent and that they were fully authorized to use physical restraints if I did not cooperate. I looked at the heavy canvas straps hanging from the man's belt. I looked at my bloody ankle and realized fighting two heavy muscle men on a deserted stretch of highway was a battle I would lose. I had to be smart. I had to play the long game. I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump to give them the illusion of a defeated old man. I told them there was no need for trouble and that I would go quietly. The driver smirked and grabbed me roughly by the arm, shoving me toward the open door. The inside of the van smelled like bleach and stale sweat. There were no windows in the back, just a cold metal bench and a bolted-down stretcher. I climbed inside and sat on the hard bench. The door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The lock clicked loudly, sealing my fate. As the van lurched forward, I leaned my head against the cold steel wall. Bradley thought he was burying me alive by sending me away. He believed that throwing me in a dark metal cage would break my spirit and silence me forever. He was absolutely dead wrong about my endless resolve. The van finally stopped after an hour of driving over rough roads. The back door swung open, revealing a gray concrete building surrounded by high chain-link fences. It did not look like a place of healing. It looked like a forgotten warehouse for the discarded elderly. Two orderlies grabbed my arms and marched me through the heavy metal doors. The air inside smelled strongly of ammonia and boiled cabbage. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a depressing yellow hum. I looked around the main common area, observing the bleak reality of the lockdown facility. Dozens of older men and women sat slumped in cheap vinyl chairs, staring blankly at a television that was turned off. Nobody was talking. Nobody was moving. They were completely sedated shells of human beings trapped in a system that profited from their silence. An orderly dragged me to a small examination room and shoved me into a hard plastic chair. A few minutes later, a heavy woman in a wrinkled white coat walked in holding a small paper cup. She did not introduce herself or look me in the eye. She simply shoved the cup toward my face and commanded me to swallow my medication. I asked her what the pills were for, since I had no medical history of mental illness. She sneered and told me I was diagnosed with severe agitation by my legal guardian, and that the doctor had prescribed heavy sedatives to keep me calm and compliant. She handed me a tiny plastic cup filled with water and stood over me waiting. I knew if I swallowed those pills, my mind would become just as foggy and broken as the poor souls sitting in the hallway. I would lose my edge. I would lose my memory. I calmly took the pills and placed them in my mouth, taking a small sip of water. But I did not swallow. I used my tongue to slide the chalky, bitter capsules deep into the pocket of my cheek. I swallowed the water loudly and opened my empty mouth to show her. She nodded, turned, and walked out of the small room. The moment the heavy door shut, I leaned forward and spit the melting pills directly into the garbage. My mind remained perfectly clear. Bradley thought he could drug me into total submission, but he had vastly underestimated my willpower and my focus. Later that evening, I was sitting alone in the dimly lit cafeteria, pushing a tray of cold mashed potatoes around with a plastic spoon. A young black nurse walked over to wipe down the tables. Her name tag read Keisha. She looked exhausted, her uniform stained with coffee and her eyes heavy from working a double shift. She stopped at my table and noticed that I was actually sitting upright and alert, unlike the other heavily medicated patients slumped in their chairs. She asked me how I was feeling today. I looked up at her and spoke with a calm, steady voice. I told her I was feeling sharp and that I did not belong in a place like this. She paused, her rag hovering over the table, looking at me with genuine surprise. She leaned in closer and whispered that my chart said I was suffering from severe late-stage dementia and violent outbursts. I gave a soft, bitter chuckle and shook my head. I told her my son-in-law had fabricated the entire file just to steal my land and cover his own massive financial debts. Keisha looked skeptical at first, but she kept listening. I pointed to the flickering fluorescent lights above us and asked her if she knew why the ballast was humming so loudly. I explained the exact electrical fault in the building wiring. I told her that back in the 1970s, I was one of the headmaster electricians for the entire city. I told her I spent decades wiring the massive power grids that kept this city running. I told her about pulling heavy copper cables through underground tunnels when men like Bradley were still in diapers. I spoke with absolute clarity, reciting old city zoning codes and electrical voltage requirements from memory. Keisha watched my eyes, searching for any sign of confusion or madness. She found none. She realized I was telling the absolute truth and that a terrible crime was being committed against me. She looked around nervously, making sure none of the orderlies were watching us. She whispered that she hated this place and the horrible way they treated people for profit. I saw empathy in her eyes. I saw she was my only ally inside this concrete prison. I leaned across the table and asked her for one desperate favor. I said my life depended entirely on her help. I told Keisha I did not want her to help me break out and risk losing her nursing license. I only needed to borrow her personal cell phone for exactly 3 minutes. She hesitated, biting her bottom lip nervously. She knew that getting caught handing a mobile device to a locked-down patient would cost her the job she desperately needed. But she looked at my steady hands and my clear eyes, and she chose to do the right human thing. Keisha reached into her scrub pocket and secretly slid a cheap black burner phone across the plastic tray. I covered it quickly with my napkin. I dialed a number I had memorized over 20 years ago. It belonged to an old retired federal judge named Vance, a man whose house I had completely rewired for free when he was just a struggling public defender. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. I kept my voice low, speaking rapidly. I told Vance that Bradley had stolen my land and locked me away. I told him to meet me at the old dirt road behind the facility exactly at midnight. Vance simply said he would be waiting there. The clock on the wall of the quiet facility ticked past midnight. The heavy silence of the ward was only broken by the soft shuffling of rubber soles on linoleum. I sat on the edge of my narrow mattress listening closely to the sounds of the hallway. Keisha was working the late shift doing her final cleaning rounds before the lights went completely dark. I watched through the small rectangular window of my door as she pushed a heavy yellow mop bucket down the corridor. She stopped right in front of the emergency fire exit at the end of the hall. She did not look toward my room. She did not give any obvious signal. She simply leaned heavily against the mop handle, pushing the plastic bucket directly into the metal crash bar of the heavy steel door. I heard a distinct mechanical click echo through the empty corridor. The magnetic lock had disengaged. Keisha calmly turned her back, leaving the mop bucket propped against the door, and walked slowly away, disappearing around the corner. I waited exactly 3 minutes, counting every single heartbeat in my chest. I slipped out of my thin facility-issued slippers and stepped onto the cold floor in my bare feet. I did not want to make a single sound. I opened my door and stepped into the dim hallway. The air was cold and smelled of bleach. I moved quickly and quietly down the corridor, keeping my back pressed against the cinder block wall. When I reached the fire exit, I pushed the heavy door open just enough to slide my body through. The cold Georgia night air hit my face like a sudden wave of pure freedom. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind me, sealing the nightmare inside. I was standing in the wet grass behind the facility, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick shadows. The ground was freezing beneath my bare feet, but I did not care about the cold. I was a free man again. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp night air fill my lungs, washing away the chemical smell of that terrible place. I did not hesitate for another single second. I turned away from the concrete building and began walking quickly into the dense, dark woods, leaving Bradley and his miserable prison far behind me in the very deep, dark shadows of the night. I navigated the rough terrain, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the tall canopy above. The sharp pine needles and broken twigs scraped painfully against the bare soles of my feet, but I pushed forward without slowing down. After walking for nearly a mile through the thick underbrush, I finally saw a dim red glow cutting through the darkness up ahead. It was the faint brake lights of a battered green pickup truck parked on an abandoned logging road. The engine was idling quietly in the cold night air. I stepped out of the tree line and approached the passenger side of the old vehicle. I opened the heavy metal door and climbed inside the warm cab. The heater was running full blast, offering an immediate relief from the freezing Georgia wind. Sitting behind the steering wheel was Vance. He was an old retired federal judge with a thick head of gray hair and eyes that had seen decades of courtroom battles. He did not ask any questions about my bare feet or my blood-stained clothes. He simply shifted the old truck into gear and drove us slowly away from the facility. Vance and I shared a deep history that went back over 30 years. Long before he was a respected federal judge sitting on a high bench, he was just a broke and struggling public defender. Back then, he was trying to save young men from the streets while drowning in his own law school debt. One cold winter night, his poorly wired house suffered a massive electrical failure that nearly burned his entire home to the ground. He had absolutely no money to pay for the massive repairs. I was a master electrician working for the city at the time. I knew Vance was a good man doing a thankless job, so I drove my work truck over to his property and spent 2 straight weeks completely rewiring his house from the foundation to the roof. I pulled every copper wire and installed every breaker myself, and I refused to take a single dollar from him for the labor. I told him back then that good men needed to look out for each other in this hard world. Vance never forgot that quiet promise. He climbed the ranks of the justice system and built a powerful career, but he always remembered the electrician who kept his house warm. Now, 3 decades later, he was the one pulling me out of the cold. As we drove down the empty highway, the silence between us was comfortable and understood. He kept his eyes strictly on the dark road ahead, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He finally broke the silence in a low, rough voice, telling me that he had made some calls and pulled some strings to get the information I needed. He told me that my arrogant son-in-law was not the wealthy genius he pretended to be. He said Bradley was hiding a very dangerous secret. We pulled into the parking lot of a lonely all-night diner on the edge of the county line. The bright neon sign buzzed loudly in the damp air, casting a harsh red glow over the empty pavement. We walked inside and sat at a corner booth far away from the tired waitress wiping down the front counter. Vance ordered 2 black coffees. Once she walked away, he unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. He spread the papers across the sticky Formica table, tapping his finger on a series of highlighted numbers. He told me he had used his old federal connections to quietly dig deep into the corporate filings of Bradley and his real estate holding company. What he found was a complete financial disaster. Bradley was absolutely drowning in a massive sea of invisible debt. The eco-resort project was not a visionary business venture. It was a desperate, frantic scheme to save his own life. Vance explained that my son-in-law had completely exhausted his credit lines with every legitimate bank in the state. In order to maintain his luxurious lifestyle and fund his failing business, Bradley had borrowed tens of millions of dollars from some very dangerous unregistered lenders. He had taken dirty money from a shadow syndicate that operated much like a ruthless criminal cartel. These were men who did not take kindly to missed payments or empty promises. The documents showed that Bradley was entirely out of time. His massive balloon payments were due at the end of the month. If he did not break ground on my stolen land immediately and secure the final $30 million bridge loan from the new investors, he would default on his shadow loans. Vance looked me directly in the eye and said that the cartel would not just seize his assets. They would take his life and they would go after Maya and the children to settle the score. Bradley was a cornered rat, terrified of the men he owed money to. He had stolen my land out of pure panicked desperation. He needed my dirt to act as the collateral for his survival. Every single arrogant threat he had made to me was built on a foundation of absolute terror. He was a dead man walking, trying desperately to buy himself one more week of breathing. Vance leaned across the table and pulled a clean cell phone from his coat. He told me he still had the personal numbers of 3 active district judges saved in his contacts. He offered to wake one of them up right now and file an emergency injunction before the sun came up. He promised he could have the local sheriff sitting at the gate of my farm with a heavy chain and a court order to stop the bulldozers from ever touching the dirt. I took a slow sip of my hot black coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I looked out the rain-streaked window at the dark highway and shook my head. I told Vance to put his phone away because we were not calling the police and we were not filing any lawsuits. Vance frowned, looking deeply confused by my calm response. He asked me why I would willingly let a desperate criminal destroy my beautiful property. I smiled a cold, quiet smile. I told him I did not want to stop the demolition. I wanted Bradley to break ground. I wanted him to dig as deep as he possibly could into my own soil. The heavy oak door to his home office was always locked, but Maya knew where he hid the spare key. It was past 2 in the morning, and the massive house was dead silent. Bradley was deeply asleep in the master bedroom, exhausted from his aggressive phone calls with his shady investors. Maya crept down the hallway, her bare feet making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slipped the small brass key into the lock and turned it slowly, wincing at the soft click. She pushed the door open and stepped inside the dark room, illuminated only by the pale moonlight filtering through the tall windows. She did not dare turn on the overhead lights. Instead, she pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and clicked it on, keeping the beam pointed directly at the floor. She moved quickly to the heavy mahogany desk sitting in the center of the room. Bradley was a meticulous man who kept his most important documents locked in the bottom right drawer. Maya pulled hard, but it was stuck. She took a deep breath, gripped the handle with both hands, and yanked. The drawer slid open with a heavy metallic scrape that made her freeze and listen for footsteps. Hearing nothing, she began sifting through the thick manila folders. She bypassed the bank statements and the corporate tax returns, searching for a specific file. Near the back, she found a thick envelope labeled with my name. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she opened it and pulled out the crisp white papers inside. It was the original property deed for the 50-acre farm. She scanned the dense legal text until her eyes landed on the final page. Right there on the bottom line was my signature. It looked absolutely perfect, capturing the exact slant and heavy pressure of my handwriting. But Maya knew the truth. She knew I had never signed this document. She stared at the forged ink, feeling a sickening wave of betrayal wash over her. Bradley had not just manipulated the medical courts. He had committed a severe federal crime to steal my land. She pulled out her phone and carefully took clear photographs of every single page, making sure the forged signature was perfectly captured. She put the papers back exactly as she found them, and then quietly left. The next afternoon, Maya drove her car to a deserted public park on the far outskirts of the city. She parked under the deep shade of a massive oak tree and looked around nervously before stepping out into the humid afternoon air. I was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench waiting patiently for her alongside Vance. I had changed out of my blood-stained clothes and was wearing a warm, clean flannel shirt and heavy jeans that Vance had graciously loaned me. When Maya saw me sitting there looking sharp and completely sane, she completely broke down. She ran across the grass and threw her arms around my neck, burying her face in my shoulder and sobbing heavily. I held my daughter tightly, resting my hand on her back, telling her softly that everything was going to be all right. She stepped back, wiping the tears from her cheeks, and pulled her phone from her leather purse. She handed it directly to Vance. She told us she had secretly broken into the locked home office of her arrogant husband late the night before. She swiped through the screen, pulling up the bright photographs of the property deed. Vance took the phone, adjusting his glasses, and examined the images closely. Maya looked at me, her voice trembling but filled with a newfound fierce determination. She confessed that she had known about the medical power of attorney, but she had absolutely no idea he was forging my actual signature to take the land. She said she was entirely done, living in absolute terror of his relentless threats and his violent temper. She looked me right in the eye and said she was ready to go to the police today. She wanted to walk straight into the local precinct today, hand over the photographs, and confess her own reluctant involvement in the medical paperwork just to get Bradley arrested. She was fully willing to risk going to jail herself if it meant saving her father and stopping the demolition of the farm. She cried, telling me that losing the house my wife and I built was a tragedy she simply could not allow to happen. She said she would testify in open court that Bradley had forged the signature and that he was a desperate criminal drowning in cartel debt. Vance looked up from the bright screen of the phone and nodded slowly, acknowledging that the clear photographs were indeed solid evidence of major real estate fraud. He told Maya that a forged deed was a serious felony, and that the local district attorney would absolutely jump at the chance to prosecute a wealthy developer for stealing from an elderly man. Maya felt a massive surge of hope, believing that this was the magic bullet we needed to end the nightmare. She wiped her eyes and quickly grabbed her silver car keys, ready to drive us straight to the main police station downtown to permanently end the entire miserable ordeal right then and there. I placed my heavy hand over her keys, stopping her from leaving the bench. Maya looked at me confused and impatient. I shook my head and told her we were not going to the police station today or any other day. I explained to her the harsh reality of the justice system when it came to wealthy white men with expensive corporate lawyers. If she walked into the police precinct with those photographs, Bradley would immediately hire the best defense attorneys in the state. They would drag the trial out for years, bleeding us dry while he continued to live in his massive mansion. Even if he was eventually convicted for forging a real estate document, a judge would likely give him a light sentence. He would serve maybe 2 years in a minimum security prison for white-collar criminals. But the damage he would inflict on her in retaliation would be permanent and absolutely devastating. I told Maya that Bradley would use his remaining power to absolutely destroy her life. He would twist her confession about the medical paperwork to prove she was an unfit mother, and he would spend his last dime ensuring she never saw her children again. Maya listened to my words, her face turning pale, as the terrifying reality of his cruelty settled over her. She asked me what we were supposed to do if we could not use the perfect evidence she had risked everything to find. I looked at her with a calm, steady gaze. I told her that sending a man like Bradley to a comfortable prison cell for a few short months was not justice. It was merely an inconvenience for him. I told her that if we wanted to truly protect our family and make sure he could never hurt anyone else again, we had to let him proceed with his master plan. We had to let him secure his massive loans, and we had to let him bring his heavy machinery onto the farm. If we stop him now, he only loses his business, I explained. But if we stand back and let him break the ground on my property, he will lose his freedom, his wealth, and his entire future forever. I told her the dirt on that farm was holding a secret that would bury him completely. We just had to let him dig the hole himself. Maya nodded, her breathing finally slowing down. She asked me what her role was in this new plan. I leaned forward and gave her a very specific and crucial task. I told her she needed to go back to that massive house and play the role of the supportive wife perfectly. She could not let Bradley suspect that she knew anything about the forged deed or his failing finances. I told her to encourage his massive ego and agree with his ridiculous vision for the eco-resort. But most importantly, I needed her to manipulate his arrogant impatience. I told Maya to casually remind Bradley that his investors were expecting rapid progress to secure their funding. I instructed her to stroke his vanity and convince him that a man of his incredible stature should not settle for a small local construction team. She needed to make sure he hired the absolute biggest and heaviest commercial excavation crew available in the entire state of Georgia. I told her to ensure he brought in the massive diesel drillers and the deep earth trenchers. Maya looked at me with a fierce understanding burning in her eyes. She promised she would make him dig. The towering glass doors of the downtown Atlanta commercial bank swung open, allowing Bradley to step into the cool, air-conditioned lobby. He wore his most expensive tailored suit, projecting the image of a fearless visionary developer. But underneath the Italian wool, he was sweating profusely. His heart hammered in his chest with the desperate rhythm of a man running out of time. He walked past the rows of ordinary tellers and headed straight for the private wealth management offices in the back. He carried a sleek leather briefcase gripped so tightly his knuckles were completely white. Inside that briefcase was the forged property deed that Maya had photographed just days before. It was his golden ticket out of the massive shadow debt he had accumulated. Bradley was escorted into a spacious corner office overlooking the city skyline. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Richard, a senior loan officer who controlled the flow of millions of dollars in corporate capital. Bradley sat down, crossing his legs and forcing a relaxed, confident smile onto his face. He opened his briefcase and slid the crisp, white documents across the polished wood. He announced that he was finally ready to secure the $30 million bridge loan for his luxury eco-resort project. He proudly presented the forged deed as absolute proof that he now held the sole legal ownership of the 50-acre property. He spun a beautiful lie about how his aging father-in-law had tragically lost his mind and graciously signed over the family land to secure its future. Richard picked up the heavy documents and adjusted his silver-framed glasses. He flipped through the pages, examining the official state seals and the flawlessly forged signature at the bottom. Bradley held his breath, feeling a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. If Richard noticed any discrepancies or asked to speak directly with me, the entire house of cards would instantly collapse. Bradley would not just lose the loan, he would go straight to federal prison for real estate fraud. But Richard simply nodded his head, looking thoroughly impressed by the sheer scale of the proposed resort. He praised Bradley for his incredible vision and his deep commitment to developing rural land. He tapped his pen against the desk and said, "Everything looked perfectly in order for the massive transfer of funds to begin immediately today." Exactly. Just as Bradley was about to reach out and shake hands, Richard paused and frowned deeply at a yellowed piece of paper buried near the very back of the file. It was an old addendum dated from 1999. Richard leaned closer to his computer screen, typing rapidly on his keyboard to cross-reference the county records. He pointed his pen at a strange and highly unusual clause buried deep within the fine print of the original property title. He told Bradley there was a restricted subterranean easement attached to the land rights, meaning the property owner did not actually have legal clearance to dig deeply below the surface soil. Richard looked concerned, explaining that such clauses were usually reserved for major municipal pipelines or hazardous waste storage and could severely complicate any large-scale commercial construction. He said the bank would absolutely require a comprehensive environmental inspection and a deep soil survey before they could authorize the release of $30 million. Bradley felt his stomach drop completely. A thorough state inspection would delay the groundbreaking by several weeks, and the dangerous men he owed money to would not wait that long. Furthermore, a legitimate inspector might discover that his entire eco-resort design was a complete architectural fraud. Bradley forced a loud, condescending laugh, waving his hand in the air to dismiss the banker's valid concerns. He leaned across the desk and confidently lied, stating that the old easement was nothing more than an abandoned plumbing system from a defunct agricultural project in the 70s. He arrogantly insisted that the old rusted pipes were completely harmless and already accounted for in his demolition budget. But Richard was a strict professional and stubbornly refused to sign the final loan approval without a certified inspector's signature verifying the safety of the soil. Bradley realized he had to act fast and resort to his usual dirty tactics. He asked Richard to excuse him for a moment and stepped out into the quiet marble hallway. He pulled out his phone and immediately dialed the number of a corrupt private land appraiser he kept on his payroll. This was a man who happily stamped fraudulent safety reports for the right price. Bradley spoke in hushed, desperate tones, offering the inspector a $50,000 cash bribe to bypass the physical survey and instantly upload a clean, forged environmental report directly into the banking database. The greedy inspector laughed and accepted the generous bribe without a single question. Within 10 minutes, a glowing, completely fabricated soil report appeared on Richard's computer screen. The corrupt appraiser falsely certified that the subterranean easement was merely old irrigation piping, posing absolutely no risk to the massive excavation plans. Richard reviewed the fake document, sighed, and finally picked up his heavy fountain pen. He stamped the appraisal, signed his name on the dotted line, and officially approved the massive loan transfer. Bradley smiled his arrogant smile, completely unaware of the federal trap he had just walked into. As soon as the final digital signature was processed, Bradley felt his cell phone vibrate heavily in his tailored jacket pocket. He pulled it out and stared down at the bright screen. It was an automated alert from his primary corporate account confirming that a wire transfer of exactly $30 million had successfully cleared. The massive sum of money sat there in bold green numbers, completely erasing the suffocating pressure that had been crushing his chest for months. He had actually done it. He had stolen my land, forged a deed, bypassed a strict environmental inspection, and legally robbed a bank right in broad daylight. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and walked out of the heavy glass doors of the bank feeling like an absolute king. The afternoon sun hit his face and he took a deep breath of the city air, believing he was completely invincible. He immediately dialed his executive assistant and ordered her to charter a private jet for the entire weekend. He told her to book the most expensive penthouse suite in Miami and invite his wealthy investors to a lavish celebration of his incredible genius. He planned to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on expensive champagne and luxury entertainment to prove to the world that his massive eco-resort was a guaranteed success. He truly believed he had outsmarted everyone. He thought Maya was just a quiet, obedient wife who would never dare question his authority. He thought I was just a broken, miserable old man rotting away in a locked room, entirely forgotten by society. He walked down the bustling Atlanta sidewalk with a victorious swagger, completely blinded by his own towering arrogance. He thought he had already won the ultimate victory here today without facing any consequence whatever. I sat quietly in the passenger seat of the dark green pickup truck parked directly across the busy street from the commercial bank. Vance sat beside me, resting his hands on the steering wheel, watching the heavy glass doors swing open. We saw Bradley step out onto the pavement, his chest puffed out like a proud rooster. Even from a distance, I could see the absolute greed radiating from his smug smile. He was busy typing on his phone, completely oblivious to the world around him. Vance leaned forward and let out a low whistle, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He quietly noted that Bradley had actually pulled it off and secured the massive $30 million loan using a completely fake deed and a bribed inspector. I did not feel angry watching him celebrate his stolen fortune. I felt a deep, quiet sense of absolute finality. By officially recording that forged deed with the commercial bank, Bradley had just claimed full legal responsibility for everything hidden beneath the surface of my 50 acres. By ignoring the clear warning of the subterranean easement and bribing an inspector to look the other way, he had bypassed the very safety measures designed to protect him. He thought he was cleverly cutting corners to build his eco-resort, but he was actually tightening a federal noose firmly around his own neck. I watched him climb into the back of a luxury black town car and speed away toward the airport. The trap was now fully and officially set for good. There was absolutely no turning back for him now. He had taken the bait, swallowed the hook, and paid for the privilege. I turned to Vance and told him to drive us home. It was finally time for Bradley to start digging. The heavy wooden doors of the family court swung open, echoing loudly in the sterile marble hallway. I walked into the courtroom, flanked by 2 large security officers, as if I were a dangerous criminal rather than a 74-year-old man. The room was freezing cold, smelling of floor wax and stale air. At the front of the room sat a massive elevated oak bench where the judge would soon decide the rest of my natural life. Bradley was already sitting at the plaintiff's table. He was flanked by 3 expensive corporate lawyers dressed in dark tailored suits. They looked like a pack of hungry wolves ready to tear apart a wounded animal. Bradley wore a custom silk tie and a smug, confident expression. He did not even bother to look in my direction when I took my seat at the empty table across the aisle. I had no legal representation. I had explicitly told Vance not to show up, and I had refused the tired public defender the state had tried to assign to me. I sat completely alone in the uncomfortable wooden chair, resting my calloused hands on the scarred table. I wore the same faded flannel shirt and heavy denim jeans Vance had loaned me. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated old man Bradley claimed I was. The heavy side door opened and the bailiff instructed everyone to rise. An older, stern-faced judge with tired eyes walked in and took his seat high above us. He adjusted his reading glasses and opened the thick manila file containing my entire life. He looked down at me with a mixture of professional detachment and quiet pity. Bradley's lead attorney immediately stood up, buttoning his expensive jacket. He began speaking with a loud, authoritative voice, filling the quiet courtroom with a mountain of perfectly rehearsed lies. He told the judge that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He submitted the fake medical evaluations and the sworn statements from the wealthy investors at the dinner party. He painted a tragic picture of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality and posed a serious physical threat to his own family. He dramatically gestured toward Bradley, praising him as a loving son-in-law who was bravely stepping up to take on the massive burden of my care. I sat there in absolute silence. The judge finally raised his hand, signaling the expensive attorney to stop talking. He turned his attention directly to me, leaning forward over the massive wooden bench. He asked me in a slow, deliberate voice if I understood why I was sitting in his courtroom today. This was the critical moment. If I spoke with the sharp, absolute clarity I actually possessed, the judge would instantly recognize that the medical reports were completely fabricated. He would order a full, independent psychological evaluation right then and there. The entire legal process would freeze. Bradley would not get his court order, and he would never be able to secure the $30 million bridge loan using my forged property deed. The trap would be completely destroyed before it even snapped shut. So I took a deep breath and began my performance. I let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look as small and frail as possible. I lowered my head, refusing to make eye contact, staring blankly at the deep scratches on the wooden table. When I finally answered the judge, I forced my voice to tremble. I let out a confused stutter, muttering a disjointed sentence about not knowing where my old work boots were. I slowly lifted my hands and let them shake visibly in the cold air. The judge frowned, his eyes softening with genuine pity. He asked me another question, this time about the night of the dinner party. He asked if I remembered breaking a heavy crystal glass in a violent rage. I blinked my eyes rapidly, acting completely lost in a deep fog of memory. I mumbled that there were too many people in the house and that the lights were much too bright. I told the judge I just wanted to go home to my farm because I needed to feed the chickens I had not owned in 20 years. Across the wide aisle, I heard a soft, satisfied chuckle. I turned my head just slightly enough to catch the expression on Bradley's face. He was leaning back in his chair with his legs crossed casually at the ankles. A huge, triumphant smirk stretched across his face. He looked at his lead attorney and gave a slow, arrogant nod. He truly believed he had won the ultimate victory. He thought his psychological warfare had genuinely broken my mind and reduced me to a babbling, helpless old fool. He was sitting there enjoying the public humiliation, completely convinced of his own supreme intelligence. The judge sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He looked at the thick stack of fake medical documents and then looked back down at my trembling hands. He asked me if I trusted my son-in-law to make important financial and medical decisions on my behalf to keep me safe from harm. I forced a single tear to well up in the corner of my right eye and let it slide slowly down my cheek. I nodded my head weakly, whispering that I was just so very tired and wanted to rest. The performance was flawless. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence, convinced they were witnessing the tragic end of a once proud and capable man. Bradley could barely contain his joy, shifting eagerly in his seat, waiting for the final gavel to strike. He thought I had surrendered to his power. He had no idea I was merely handing him the rope he desperately needed to hang himself permanently. I was steering his massive ego directly into the path of an oncoming federal disaster without him noticing a single thing. The judge picked up his wooden gavel and brought it down with a loud crack that sealed my fate in the eyes of the law. He officially granted the petition awarding Bradley full permanent guardianship over my medical decisions and my entire estate. He announced that I was officially deemed incompetent to manage my own affairs. Bradley stood up quickly, mimicking the solemn posture of a caring family member. He thanked the judge, promising to provide me with professional care. I remained seated in my chair, keeping my head bowed, my hands resting on the table. Sitting directly behind Bradley in the public gallery was my daughter Maya. I slowly turned my head and looked back at her. She was staring at me with an expression of absolute devastation. She did not know I was putting on a calculated performance to trap her husband. She truly believed the traumatic events of the past week had genuinely shattered my mind. She believed I had finally surrendered to the crushing pressure of old age and the cruel abuse of her arrogant husband. Silent tears streamed down her face, ruining her makeup and soaking her blouse. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, trying desperately to muffle her heartbroken sobs. She thought she had lost her father completely today. Seeing her cry broke my heart, but I knew I could not break character. I could not give her a reassuring nod or a comforting smile. The walls of the courtroom had eyes, and Bradley's lawyers were watching every move I made. I had to let her mourn the temporary loss of my dignity today so that I could guarantee her permanent freedom tomorrow. The pain in her beautiful brown eyes was the absolute highest price I had to pay for this elaborate revenge. The bailiff opened the heavy wooden doors, and the crowded courtroom began to slowly empty out into the sterile marble hallway. Bradley walked out completely surrounded by his expensive legal team, celebrating their massive victory with loud, arrogant laughter. I stood up slowly from my uncomfortable wooden chair, making sure my knees trembled slightly as I walked down the center aisle. When I crossed the threshold into the bright hallway, Bradley intentionally stepped directly into my path, blocking my exit. He looked down at me with a condescending smirk, crossing his arms over his tailored suit jacket. He told me I would be going back to the locked facility today, and that my farm would be completely leveled by tomorrow morning. He thought I would cry or beg for mercy. Instead, I stopped, leaning slightly closer to him. I dropped my pathetic, confused act entirely for just one single second. My voice was no longer trembling. It was cold and sharp like a steel blade. I looked into his eyes and whispered, "I hope you dig deep, boy." Bradley burst into a loud, mocking laugh, completely ignoring the warning as he walked directly toward his own federal funeral tomorrow. The morning after the court hearing, Bradley wasted no time. He had $30 million sitting in his corporate account and a burning desire to completely erase my legacy from the earth. He did not hire a standard local construction crew. He contracted the largest commercial demolition fleet available in the entire state of Georgia. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the quiet country road leading to my farm was choked with heavy diesel machinery. Massive yellow excavators, steel-tracked bulldozers, and heavy earth movers rumbled through the wrought iron gates I had built with my own hands. The loud roar of their engines shook the ground, scaring away the birds and shattering the peace I had cultivated for 4 decades. Bradley arrived on the scene in his silver sports car, stepping out into the morning mist wearing an expensive suit and a bright white hard hat. He stood near the edge of the property, pointing his finger like a dictator, ordering his troops into battle. He did not direct the crews to start at the empty acreage near the back of the property. He specifically ordered the foreman to bring the heaviest machinery directly to the front lawn. He wanted them to start with the old wooden farmhouse and my late wife Beatrice's prized flower garden. Beatrice had spent 30 years tending to those rare blue hydrangeas and wild climbing roses. They were the physical embodiment of her gentle, beautiful soul. Bradley knew how much that garden meant to me and to Maya. He wanted to destroy it first purely out of spite. He wanted to watch the steel teeth of the excavators rip through the delicate roots and crush the wooden porch where Beatrice and I used to sit every summer evening. He walked over to the site foreman, a burly man with a thick beard, and handed him a rolled-up set of blueprints. He raised his voice over the deafening roar of the diesel engines, commanding the crew to level the house to the dirt and grind the garden into mud before lunchtime. He smiled a twisted smile as the massive metal tracks tore into the soft green grass of the front lawn, leaving deep, ugly scars in the earth. He was reveling in the sheer destructive power his stolen money had bought today, completely unaware of what he was about to awaken right beneath him. Maya drove to the farm early that morning, hoping she could save a few precious things before the machines destroyed everything. She parked on the gravel shoulder and ran past the guards holding a cardboard box in her trembling hands. She desperately wanted to salvage her mother's photo albums, the hand-stitched quilts, and the small porcelain birds on the mantel. When she saw the massive excavator swinging its iron bucket dangerously close to the porch, she panicked. She rushed across the lawn, waving frantically and screaming for the operator to stop. The foreman saw her and blew a loud air horn, halting the machine just inches away from the wooden roof. The sudden silence that followed was heavy and tense. Maya dropped her cardboard box on the grass and ran up the front steps, tears streaming down her face. She was completely frantic, pleading with the foreman to give her just 10 minutes to grab her mother's memories from inside the house. Before the confused foreman could even answer, Bradley stormed over from his silver car. His face was flushed red with absolute rage. He did not care that Maya was his wife. He did not care that the tough construction workers were watching them closely. He marched right up to the wooden porch, grabbed Maya violently by the upper arm, and yanked her backwards so hard she almost lost her balance and fell into the mud. He began screaming at her at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing viciously across the open fields. He called her a pathetic, weak fool for caring about a pile of worthless garbage. He told her she was embarrassing him in front of his hired crew and ruining his strict corporate schedule. Maya tried to pull her arm away, begging him softly to just let her take the photo albums. She cried, telling him that those pictures were all she had left of her childhood and her beloved mother. But Bradley squeezed her arm even tighter, his fingers digging painfully into her skin. He leaned into her face and snarled that her childhood was completely meaningless now. He yelled that he was the only future she had and that everything in that rotting house was going to be buried under 50 feet of concrete. The construction workers looked away, shifting uncomfortably on their feet. Even these hardened men who tore down buildings for a living were deeply disgusted by the raw cruelty radiating from the wealthy developer. They saw the sheer terror in Maya's eyes and the brutal way Bradley pushed her roughly back toward the gravel driveway. He ordered her to get in her car and drive away immediately before he called the security guards to physically drag her off the property. Maya stood trembling by her car, wiping her tears as the engines roared back to life. In that terrible moment, she saw the absolute truth. Bradley was not a husband. He was a monster who enjoyed inflicting pain. Word of the violent confrontation reached me within the hour. Keisha, the kind nurse from the locked facility, had actually driven out to check on me, and she passed by the farm just as Maya was speeding away in tears. Keisha called Vance, who immediately relayed the disturbing information to me as we sat in his quiet study. Hearing how Bradley had publicly manhandled my daughter ignited a fierce, blinding rage in my chest. For a brief moment, my cold, calculated patience completely fractured. I wanted to drive my truck through those iron gates, jump out with a heavy steel wrench, and shatter every bone in his arrogant face. My breathing grew heavy and my hands balled into tight, trembling fists. Vance saw the dark fury radiating from my eyes. He placed a steadying hand on my shoulder and asked me the question I was already asking myself. He pointed to his desk phone, offering to make the call to the federal authorities right now. He said we could pull the plug immediately. He reminded me that the deed was forged, that the land was federally protected, and that we had more than enough evidence to put Bradley in handcuffs by noon. He warned me that if we waited any longer, the bulldozers would completely destroy my house and erase 30 years of my beautiful memories with Beatrice. He looked at me with deep, genuine concern, asking if this elaborate trap was truly worth the agonizing emotional cost. I closed my eyes and took a long, deep breath, forcing the burning anger back down into the dark corners of my mind. I pictured my wife standing in her garden, smiling in the summer sun. I pictured the wood I had cut, the nails I had hammered, and the life we had built on that soil. It hurt deeply to know that the physical walls of our history were about to be crushed into splinters by a greedy, desperate coward. But then I pictured Maya crying in the mud, trapped in a cycle of abuse she could not escape. I realized that keeping a wooden house standing was not worth sacrificing my daughter's future. I opened my eyes and looked at my old friend. I told him we were not stopping anything today. I told Vance to put his phone away because the trap had to snap shut on its own. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the small pot sitting on the mahogany desk and walked over to the window. The sky outside was turning a dark gray, threatening another heavy Georgia rainstorm. Vance sat quietly in his leather chair, waiting for my final reasoning. I looked at him and spoke with a voice completely devoid of any doubt or hesitation. I explained that simply arresting Bradley today would never teach him the true magnitude of his arrogance. If the police dragged him away before the destruction began, he would always believe he was a victim of circumstance. He would sit in his prison cell and convince himself that he was a misunderstood genius who was just incredibly unlucky. I took a long, slow sip of my bitter, hot coffee, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. A man needs to see his own foundations crumble before he builds something real, I told my friend quietly. Bradley thinks he is destroying my legacy to build his own empire, but I need him to swing the hammer himself. I need him to feel the exact moment his entire world shatters into pieces. Let the massive machines roll today. The dark purple bruise forming on her upper arm was the final catalyst my daughter needed to completely shatter her remaining illusions. Maya stood in the massive marble bathroom of their master suite, staring at her reflection in the mirror under the harsh vanity lights. She traced the outline of Bradley's cruel fingers on her skin, feeling a profound and cold awakening wash over her. The man sleeping in the bedroom next door was not the charming entrepreneur she had married. He was a ruthless parasite who had stolen her father's land and treated her like disposable garbage in front of strangers. She turned off the bathroom light and crept back into the dark bedroom. Bradley was snoring heavily, oblivious to the silent transformation happening right beside him. His expensive silver tablet was resting on the oak nightstand plugged into the wall charger. Maya knew Bradley guarded that device with his life, usually carrying it everywhere. She held her breath, stepping lightly across the plush carpet, and carefully slid the tablet off the table. She carried it downstairs to the dark kitchen, locking the heavy pantry door behind her. She sat on the cold tile floor and pressed the power button. The screen illuminated her face, demanding a numeric passcode. Maya had never tried to invade his privacy before, but today the rules of her marriage had permanently changed. She tried his birth date and the system rejected it. She tried their wedding anniversary and the red error message flashed again. Then she remembered his towering, absolute arrogance. She typed in the date he founded his real estate company, and the tablet instantly unlocked. Maya felt a sharp surge of adrenaline as she stared at his private home screen. She tapped on his secure email application and his encrypted financial folders, expecting to find the usual bank statements and construction invoices. She was looking for anything that could help Vance build a stronger case against him after the farm was destroyed. But as she began reading the hidden documents, she realized the theft of my 50 acres was only a tiny fraction of a massive criminal conspiracy. My brave daughter sat alone in the dark pantry, quietly reading the digital evidence of a staggering financial crime that went far deeper than either Vance or myself could have ever possibly imagined. She was about to uncover his darkest and deepest secrets. Maya opened a hidden spreadsheet labeled with a cryptic alphanumeric code. As her eyes scanned the endless rows of international wire transfers, a horrifying truth began to materialize on the glowing screen. Bradley was not just building a luxury eco-resort to pay off his shadow debt. He was running a massive international Ponzi scheme right out of their suburban mansion. The documents revealed that Bradley had spent the last 2 years aggressively marketing the unbuilt resort to wealthy foreign investors overseas. He had created beautiful fake brochures featuring computer-generated images of pristine swimming pools and luxury cabins sitting directly on my land. He had promised these foreign buyers guaranteed high-return rental incomes and exclusive vacation rights. Maya saw that he had already successfully pre-sold over 80 luxury units that did not even physically exist. He had collected millions of dollars in non-refundable deposits from investors in Europe and Asia who trusted his fraudulent corporate portfolio. But he had not used a single dollar of that foreign investment money to hire architects or secure legitimate construction permits. Instead, he had taken their massive deposits and secretly funneled the cash directly to the dangerous cartel lenders to temporarily keep himself alive. He was paying off his old violent debts with brand new stolen money. The sheer scale of the fraud was absolutely breathtaking. He had stolen my 50-acre farm simply to maintain the elaborate illusion. He needed the heavy bulldozers to tear up my front lawn so he could take pictures and record videos of the active construction site. He planned to send those videos to the foreign investors to prove that the massive project was finally underway and to demand their next round of multi-million-dollar funding. He never actually intended to finish building the luxury resort because the money required to build it was already gone. He was digging a massive hole in the ground just to buy himself a few more months of breathing room before the entire fraudulent house of cards inevitably collapsed on top of him. Maya sat on the kitchen floor feeling incredibly sick to her stomach. She realized her husband was not just an arrogant bully. He was a high-level international criminal who had defrauded dozens of powerful people out of their life savings. If the authorities discovered this elaborate Ponzi scheme, Bradley would not just face a few years in a minimum security prison for forging a property deed. He would be facing decades in a federal penitentiary for massive wire fraud and international money laundering. She scrolled further down the screen, finding the most terrifying document of all. It was a secret contingency plan Bradley had quietly arranged in case the foreign investors or the cartel discovered his massive deception. She realized with absolute certainty that he was a complete monster who cared only about his own selfish survival. The terrifying information she discovered next made the blood in her veins run entirely cold. Maya quickly opened an anonymous email account she had secretly created the day before. Her hands were shaking violently, but she managed to attach the massive spreadsheets and the forged investor contracts to a new message. She typed in the secure email address Vance had provided and hit send, watching the progress bar slowly fill as the digital evidence flew across the city. After confirming the files were sent, she clicked on a locked folder titled Offshore Assets. Inside, she found the final piece of Bradley's desperate escape plan. He had recently opened a hidden, untraceable bank account in the Cayman Islands under a completely fake corporate name. Over the past 3 months, he had been quietly skimming money from the foreign investor deposits and funneling it into this secret offshore account. The current balance sat at exactly $5 million. He had also purchased a private one-way plane ticket to a country with absolutely no extradition treaty with the United States. The flight was scheduled to depart in less than 2 weeks. Bradley knew his massive Ponzi scheme was entirely unsustainable. He knew the cartel lenders would eventually realize he was out of money, and he knew the foreign investors would eventually demand to see their finished luxury cabins. He was using the demolition of my farm as a final grand distraction. While the heavy machinery was busy tearing down my house and digging up my soil, creating the loud illusion of progress, he was quietly preparing to abandon his family and flee the country forever. He was going to leave Maya and his 2 young children behind to deal with the absolute catastrophic fallout. When the cartel came looking for their missing millions, Maya would be the only one left sitting in the massive house for them to find. He was willingly sacrificing his own wife and children to save his own miserable life. Maya stared at the electronic plane ticket, feeling a mix of profound grief and intense boiling rage. She took screenshots of the offshore bank account and the flight itinerary, sending them directly to Vance as well. She carefully deleted all the newly sent emails from the silver digital tablet, cleared the recent viewing history, and quietly sneaked back upstairs to return the device to the nightstand before he ever woke up, making absolutely sure her silent presence remained completely undetected by him forever. I was sitting in the quiet study with Vance when the encrypted files finally arrived on his computer. We spent the next hour reading through the massive offshore bank statements and the international wire transfers. When Vance opened the image of the one-way plane ticket, his face turned incredibly pale. He looked across the desk at me and said Bradley was a major flight risk. If we waited too long to spring the federal trap, Bradley would simply board that private jet and disappear across the ocean with $5 million, leaving my daughter at the mercy of violent criminals. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my chest. My original plan was to let him slowly destroy the farm over the next few weeks to maximize his financial ruin. But the discovery of his secret escape plan completely changed the timeline. We could no longer afford to be patient. I told Vance we had to force his hand immediately. We needed Bradley to dig his own grave much faster than he ever originally intended. I picked up the phone to call Maya. It was time to aggressively accelerate the demolition schedule and finally end this terrible nightmare. The evening sky over my farm was painted in deep shades of purple and gold, as a fleet of luxury vehicles rolled through my ruined front gates. Bradley was not a man who could simply start a construction project quietly. He needed an audience to validate his massive ego. To celebrate the official groundbreaking of his fraudulent resort, he decided to throw a lavish outdoor gala right on top of my torn-up front lawn. He had hired a massive team of event planners to transform the muddy construction site into a scene of ridiculous opulence. They erected a massive white canvas tent, illuminated by hundreds of glowing string lights that reflected off the polished, expensive cars parked on my crushed flower beds. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the uneven terrain, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and imported caviar. The air was filled with the soft sounds of a live jazz quartet playing in the corner, completely drowning out the natural evening sounds of the Georgia countryside. High society elites and wealthy local investors mingled under the glowing canvas, completely unaware that they were standing on a stolen property funded by a massive criminal Ponzi scheme. Bradley stood at the very center of the massive tent wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo costing more than my first truck. He held a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and used the other to gesture wildly as he told his fabricated stories of real estate triumph. He was soaking up the admiration of the wealthy crowd, projecting the image of a fearless visionary who was bringing modern luxury to the rural South. I watched the entire sickening display from the shadows of the tree line just beyond the glow of the bright tent lights. I saw the massive yellow excavators parked silently in the distance, waiting like hungry steel beasts to resume their digging at dawn. Bradley had strategically placed the heavy machinery around the perimeter of the party as a backdrop for his grand vision. He wanted everyone to see the physical proof of his power and his momentum. He felt entirely untouchable tonight, surrounded by the rich and powerful people he so desperately wanted to impress. He thought he had outsmarted everyone and secured his golden future. He absolutely did not know that I was standing in the dark watching his final moments of arrogant joy. I stepped out from the cover of the dark pine trees and began walking slowly toward the glowing white event tent. I was not dressed for a high society celebration gala. I wore my old faded denim overalls over a heavy thermal shirt. My thick leather work boots were coated in dried gray mud from walking. I did not belong among the silk dresses and tailored tuxedos, but this was my land, and I walked across it exactly as I pleased. As I approached the edge of the bright light, the soft chatter of the wealthy guests began to falter. Heads turned in my direction, and the clinking of crystal glasses slowly ceased. People stepped aside, parting like a wave as I moved deliberately through the crowd. They looked at my calloused hands and my weathered face with a mixture of quiet alarm and deep confusion. I ignored their stares and kept my eyes locked entirely on the center of the room. Within seconds, 2 massive private security guards spotted me. They recognized my face from the legal eviction order. They dropped their hands to their utility belts and moved quickly to intercept me before I could reach the wealthy investors. They flanked me on both sides, grabbing my arms with heavy, rough hands, preparing to drag me back out into the darkness of the woods. But before they could pull me away, a loud, sharp voice echoed across the quiet tent. It was Bradley. He had spotted me from the main stage, and he quickly raised his hand, signaling the armed guards to stop. He did not look angry or threatened by my sudden appearance. Instead, a massive, cruel smile spread across his handsome face. He saw my faded clothes and my dirty boots, and he saw the perfect opportunity to publicly humiliate me in front of the most powerful people in the city. He wanted to use my presence to elevate his own twisted narrative of triumph. He gestured for the heavy guards to release my arms and told them to let the old man approach the stage. The security men stepped back reluctantly, keeping a close eye on my hands. I walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from the elevated platform where Bradley was standing. The entire tent was completely silent now, save for the gentle rustling of the canvas roof in the night wind. Hundreds of wealthy eyes were fixed on the strange standoff between the polished young developer and the old tired electrician in dirty overalls. Bradley looked down at me from his elevated stage, practically vibrating with sheer arrogant delight. He held his expensive microphone tightly in his right hand, ready to deliver his final, devastating blow to my dignity. He thought I had wandered out of the locked facility in a state of deep mental confusion, looking for my ruined house. He believed I was a broken, defeated man who had come crawling back to beg for mercy in the mud. He had absolutely no idea that I was simply here to deliver the final, precise measurement for his federal coffin. Bradley tapped his expensive microphone, sending a sharp, screeching feedback noise through the massive speakers that instantly commanded the attention of every single guest in the tent. The soft jazz music abruptly stopped, and the wealthy crowd turned their faces toward the elevated stage. Bradley smiled warmly at his audience, placing a hand over his heart in a sickening display of fake compassion. He looked down at me, standing quietly in the dirt, and then looked back out at the sea of tailored suits. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice echoing loudly across the ruined farm. I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge a very special guest who has wandered onto our construction site tonight. He gestured toward me with a wide, patronizing sweep of his arm. Please do not be alarmed by his rugged appearance or his confusion. This is my father-in-law, Roland. The crowd let out a collective murmur of sympathetic whispers. Bradley continued milking the dramatic moment for all it was worth. As many of you know, my father-in-law is suffering from a very severe mental decline. He is a confused old man from the past who tragically lost his grip on reality. He believes this dirt still belongs to him because his fading memory cannot process the incredible modern progress we are bringing to this community today. Bradley paused, taking a slow, dramatic sip of his champagne, while the audience looked at me with deep pity. He wiped his mouth and leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice to sound incredibly sincere. It breaks my heart to see him like this, wandering in the mud, completely lost in his own broken mind. But this is exactly why my beautiful wife and I stepped up to take legal control of his life and this property. We are transforming his forgotten, useless dirt into a glorious future that will benefit everyone standing in this tent tonight. He pointed his finger directly at my chest, mocking me in front of hundreds of people. You see, Roland represents the slow, stubborn decay of the past, but we represent the brilliant, unstoppable future. He raised his crystal glass high into the air, proposing a toast to his own magnificent genius, while the crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Bradley stared down at me with absolute vicious triumph, certain he had finally destroyed my spirit. The deafening sound of applause washed over me like a hollow, empty wave. I did not flinch or lower my head in shame. I stood perfectly still, letting the wealthy investors and the high society elites laugh at my expense. I watched Bradley drink his champagne, soaking in the toxic glory he had built on a foundation of lies. He lowered his microphone, expecting me to slowly shuffle away in complete humiliation. Instead, I slowly lifted my head and looked directly past him, making deliberate eye contact with the flashing lenses of the corporate cameras recording the entire event for his foreign investors. A slow, genuine smile spread across my weathered face, completely breaking the illusion of my broken mind. The quiet confidence in my eyes made Bradley suddenly falter. His triumphant smirk slightly wavered as I took one step closer to the stage. I did not need a microphone for my voice to carry the absolute weight of my promise. I looked right up into his arrogant eyes and spoke with crystal-clear precision. Just make sure your excavators dig past 15 feet. I turned my back on his silent confusion and walked happily away into the dark night. The sun had not even crested the horizon when the heavy diesel engines roared to life. It was exactly 6 in the morning and a thick gray fog hung low over my 50-acre farm. Bradley had ordered the construction crews to arrive before dawn, completely consumed by his desperate timeline. I sat in the passenger seat of Vance's truck, parked on a high ridge about a half-mile away, watching the destruction unfold through a pair of heavy brass binoculars. The sheer scale of the machinery he had rented was staggering. There were 4 massive yellow excavators equipped with deep earth-trenching buckets and 2 towering industrial drillers designed to bore through solid bedrock. Bradley stood near the ruined front gates, wearing his pristine white hard hat and holding a steaming cup of coffee. He waved his arm in a wide, aggressive arc, signaling the site foreman to begin the assault. The first excavator lurched forward, its heavy steel tracks grinding my beautiful green lawn into thick brown mud. The operator lowered the massive iron bucket and slammed it directly into the front porch of my old farmhouse. The wooden beams I had cut and nailed by hand 40 years ago splintered with a deafening crack. The roof collapsed inward, sending a huge plume of dust into the damp morning air. I watched Beatrice's rose bushes disappear under the crushing weight of the steel tracks, completely erased in a matter of seconds. Bradley did not even flinch at the destruction. He was practically bouncing on the balls of his feet, eagerly checking his expensive silver watch. He directed the heavy drillers to move past the rubble of the house and head straight for the open pasture near the center of the property. That was exactly where he planned to dig the massive foundation for his luxury resort lobby. The ground there was soft and the drilling rigs moved into position with loud mechanical groans. The operators engaged the heavy hydraulic gears and the massive steel augers began to quickly chew into the deep wet Georgia clay. The noise was absolutely deafening, echoing across the quiet countryside like the thunder of a mechanized war. Bradley watched the dark dirt flying high into the air with a very wide, greedy smile, completely unaware of the deadly secret resting just 15 feet below the surface of his stolen empire right here today, as the massive drills plunged deeper into the earth. Bradley pulled his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket. He tapped the screen to start a live video broadcast directly to his private network of wealthy foreign investors. He held the phone high in the air, panning the camera across the busy construction site to show off the heavy machinery and the sheer scale of his operation. He spoke loudly over the roaring engines, flashing his perfectly white teeth at the camera. He proudly announced that the groundbreaking phase was officially underway and running ahead of schedule. He promised his viewers that this was the exact moment their incredible luxury resort was transforming from a beautiful dream into a highly profitable reality. He walked dangerously close to the edge of the expanding trench, pointing the camera down into the deep hole being carved out by the primary industrial drill. The drill had effortlessly passed the 10-foot mark, churning up loose soil and rocks without any resistance. Bradley boasted to his investors about the pristine quality of the land, boldly lying about how thoroughly he had surveyed the property. He confidently assured the audience watching his live stream that they would see rapid daily progress, and that the massive foundation would be completely poured by the end of the month. The drill bit reached 14 feet deep, and the engine continued its steady, powerful hum. Then it hit 15 feet. At exactly 16 feet deep, the situation instantly changed. The massive spinning steel auger struck something unimaginably hard. It was not bedrock. It was not a large boulder. The impact was so violently sudden that the entire 30-ton drilling rig actually lifted a few inches off the muddy ground. A deafening metallic screech tore through the air, sounding like a train violently derailing on a steel track. Bradley stumbled backward, almost dropping his phone in shock. Before the operator could even reach for the emergency shut-off lever, a massive shower of brilliant blue and white sparks shot straight up out of the deep trench. The sparks flew 20 feet into the air, raining down on the terrified construction crew. A loud popping noise echoed across the field, followed instantly by the harsh smell of burning ozone and melting electrical wires. The primary drill motor violently short-circuited, sending a thick cloud of acrid black smoke pouring out of the engine housing. The massive machine shuddered violently for a few seconds before dying completely with a heavy groaning clatter. The other excavators immediately powered down their engines as the operators stared in absolute horror at the smoking rig. A sudden, eerie silence fell over the ruined pasture. Bradley stood completely frozen, staring into his phone camera with his mouth hanging open. His live stream was still broadcasting the absolute disaster to his wealthy investors. He had finally hit the absolute rock bottom of his stolen empire right in front of everyone watching, and his nightmare had now only just begun. Bradley quickly fumbled with his phone, frantically tapping the screen to abruptly end the live broadcast to his investors. He shoved the device back into his pocket, his face entirely flushed with extreme panic and uncontrollable rage. He yelled at the top of his lungs, demanding to know what had just happened. The site foreman cautiously approached the edge of the deep trench, waving away the thick black smoke to inspect the massive damage. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from his belt and pointed the bright beam down into the massive hole. At the very bottom, 16 feet below the muddy surface, the dirt had been completely cleared away by the violent spinning action of the ruined drill bit. Exposed in the dark earth was a smooth, uninterrupted surface of thick military-grade titanium casing. It was entirely unlike any normal municipal pipe or standard electrical conduit. It looked like the reinforced hull of a nuclear submarine buried directly beneath the quiet Georgia clay. The thick metal was completely unbothered by the heavy drill bit, displaying only a shallow, bright scratch where the carbon steel had catastrophically failed against it. Bradley marched to the edge of the pit, looking down at the massive metal obstruction. He refused to accept that his elaborate plans had just crashed into an immovable physical wall. He was absolutely furious, spitting as he screamed at the seasoned foreman. He arrogantly insisted that it was just some leftover junk from an old abandoned farm project. He demanded that the heavy machinery be moved aside immediately. He wildly ordered the foreman to send a team of men down into the deep trench right now. With heavy industrial plasma torches and diamond-tipped concrete saws, he aggressively commanded them to cut straight through the thick titanium casing, regardless of what it was or who owned it. He told the terrified construction workers that time was money, and his wealthy foreign investors were actively waiting for their luxury resort. He yelled that he did not care if they had to melt the entire metal structure into liquid slag. He was fully prepared to destroy whatever lay beneath his stolen dirt to save his failing financial empire. He thought his money and his stolen deed gave him absolute authority over the earth itself. He completely failed to understand the massive scale of the giant federal trap he had violently awoken. The foreman shook his head frantically, taking 2 large steps away from the deep trench. He aimed his bright flashlight directly at the center of the massive metal casing, revealing a series of highly classified yellow and black warning symbols painted underneath. The dirt. The terrifying insignias clearly marked the structure as critical, United States military infrastructure strictly protected by the Department of Defense. He looked at Bradley with wide, terrified eyes, flatly refusing to send any of his men down there. He knew that cutting into federal military property was an act of domestic terrorism that carried an immediate federal prison sentence. He loudly ordered all construction crews to immediately step back and power down their equipment right now. Bradley lost his mind entirely. Driven by absolute panic and overwhelming debt, he screamed that he was the supreme boss here. He ran over to a nearby utility truck and violently grabbed a heavy steel sledgehammer from the open tool bed, ignoring the desperate warnings from the seasoned foreman. Bradley foolishly jumped directly down into the deep, muddy trench himself, blindly determined to smash through the federal casing alone and save his completely doomed criminal empire today exactly as planned. Bradley stood at the bottom of the muddy trench, gripping the heavy steel sledgehammer with both hands. He was completely consumed by his own reckless desperation. The thick titanium casing rested silently beneath his expensive leather shoes, mocking his entire fraudulent empire. He raised the heavy hammer high above his head and brought it down with every ounce of strength he possessed. The massive steel head struck the military-grade casing with a deafening metallic clang that sent a violent shockwave vibrating straight up his arms. He stumbled backward, dropping the hammer in the mud, his hands totally numb from the severe impact. The casing did not even have a single tiny dent. He screamed in pure frustration, preparing to pick up the hammer for a second strike, but he never got the chance. A sudden thunderous roar echoed across the ruined pasture, drowning out the idle diesel engines of the heavy machinery. It was not the sound of standard local police sirens. It was the deep, aggressive roar of high-performance engines being pushed to their absolute limits. Suddenly, the heavy wrought iron gates of my farm were violently smashed open. 10 massive black sport utility vehicles came tearing through the entrance, kicking up huge clouds of dirt and gravel as they sped directly toward the construction site. These were not the local county sheriffs. These vehicles had heavily tinted windows, reinforced steel bumpers, and thick armor plating. A massive black helicopter suddenly appeared over the tree line, the deafening beat of its heavy rotor blades shaking the leaves off the branches. The black vehicles formed a tight tactical perimeter, completely surrounding the deep trench and trapping everyone inside. The terrified construction workers immediately dropped their tools and raised their hands in the air, realizing this was a massive federal operation. The doors of the black vehicles flew open simultaneously, and dozens of men dressed in dark olive tactical gear poured out. They wore heavy bulletproof vests, displaying the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security. Bradley looked up from the bottom of the deep, muddy trench, his arrogant face completely drained of color. He watched in absolute paralyzing terror as the massive weight of the United States federal government descended directly onto his stolen property. He had absolutely no idea how to stop the incredible nightmare he had just unleashed. Before Bradley could even process the incredible reality of the situation, heavily armed tactical agents began moving with terrifying speed and absolute precision. They did not walk, they advanced like a highly trained military unit striking a hostile target. Dozens of agents swarmed the muddy perimeter of the deep excavation trench, pointing their black assault rifles directly down into the massive hole. Red laser sights danced across the wet dirt and locked instantly onto Bradley's expensive tailored suit. Several agents slid down the steep, muddy embankments, shouting aggressive, overlapping commands that echoed loudly over the roar of the hovering helicopter. They ordered him to drop his weapon and get down on the ground immediately. Bradley was completely paralyzed by the sheer, overwhelming force of the assault. His mind was totally shattered, unable to comprehend how a simple real estate project had instantly transformed into a massive federal raid. He stood frozen at the bottom of the deep pit, still loosely gripping the heavy steel sledgehammer in his right hand. He tried to open his mouth to explain that he was the wealthy property owner, but his vocal cords completely failed him. A tall, heavily armored federal agent interpreted his hesitation as active resistance. The agent charged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He tackled Bradley with incredible brutal force, driving his heavily padded shoulder straight into Bradley's chest. The violent impact lifted my arrogant son-in-law completely off his feet and threw him backward into the thick, freezing mud. The heavy sledgehammer flew from his grasp, landing harmlessly near the exposed titanium casing. Bradley gasped for air, feeling the crushing weight of the tactical agent pressing his face deep into the wet dirt. 2 more armed agents immediately piled on top of him, twisting his arms violently behind his back. He screamed in sudden sharp pain as heavy steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. The pristine white hard hat he had worn so proudly just minutes ago was completely trampled into the mud beside his face. An agent grabbed him roughly by the collar of his ruined, expensive jacket and hauled him up onto his knees. The tall agent stood over him, completely blocking out the morning sun. He raised his black assault rifle and pointed the cold steel barrel directly at Bradley's forehead. The red laser sight rested directly between his terrified, wide-open eyes. Bradley was gasping heavily, spitting out the foul-tasting mud, trembling violently like a frightened small child. He looked up at the circle of heavily armed federal agents surrounding him, desperately searching for any sign of a simple misunderstanding. But he found absolutely no mercy in their cold, professional faces. He was no longer a powerful real estate developer or a wealthy corporate CEO. In that deep, muddy trench surrounded by the terrifying might of the federal government, Bradley was finally facing the ultimate severe consequences of his massive greed and his catastrophic arrogance. The deafening sound of the black helicopter slowly faded as the massive aircraft climbed higher into the gray morning sky, leaving a tense, heavy silence hanging over the deep, muddy trench. The circle of tactical agents parted slightly, allowing a commanding figure to step forward to the very edge of the steep embankment. He was the lead federal agent, dressed in a crisp, dark windbreaker with bold yellow lettering across his chest. He did not carry an assault rifle, but his piercing, unblinking stare was far more intimidating than any weapon. He looked down at Bradley, who was still kneeling in the freezing mud with his hands tightly cuffed behind his back. The lead agent reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and slowly pulled out a thick folded document bearing the official red seal of the United States government. He unfolded the thick paper, deliberately making sure Bradley could clearly see the highly classified markings stamped across the top of the page. The agent spoke with a deep, booming voice that carried absolute, unquestionable authority across the ruined farm. Bradley Pierce, you are hereby under immediate arrest for the extreme federal crimes of domestic terrorism and the direct physical sabotage of United States critical infrastructure. The heavy words hung in the damp air, striking Bradley like a series of brutal physical blows to his chest. The agent coldly continued reading from the official document, stating that the massive titanium structure buried in the trench was a classified military fiber-optic neural network connecting the entire eastern seaboard defense grid directly to the Pentagon. He explained that any unauthorized person attempting to damage, breach, or destroy this highly sensitive casing was automatically classified as a highly dangerous threat to national security. Bradley blinked wildly, shaking his head in absolute furious denial. He desperately tried to process the terrifying magnitude of the severe charges being leveled against him. He had fully expected to eventually face a minor civil lawsuit or perhaps a quiet corporate audit if his massive financial schemes ever collapsed. But he had absolutely never imagined that his arrogant shortcuts would trigger a massive national security protocol. The crushing reality of his terrible situation finally began to sink deep into his selfish brain. He was not going to a comfortable white-collar holding cell for real estate fraud. He was going straight to a dark federal black site. Bradley twisted violently against the tight steel handcuffs, completely ignoring the terrible pain shooting through his shoulders. He tilted his head upward, screaming hysterically at the tall lead agent standing above him. He yelled that there had to be a massive mistake, frantically claiming that he held the legal deed to the entire 50-acre property. He screamed that he was the rightful corporate owner of the dirt and had the absolute legal right to dig wherever he wanted. He demanded his expensive lawyers and threatened to sue the federal government for trespassing on his private resort development. The lead agent listened to the pathetic outburst with an expression of absolute stone-cold indifference. He slowly folded the classified document and tucked it neatly back into his windbreaker pocket. He looked down at the broken, arrogant man kneeling in the mud and simply shook his head. No, Pierce. the agent replied, his voice perfectly calm and utterly devastating. "You might own the grass, but the dirt you are standing on right now is highly classified federal ground." The agent signaled his men and they violently dragged Bradley away toward the waiting black vehicles, effectively ending his pathetic reign of terror. The dark green pickup truck rolled slowly through the ruined front gates of my farm, stopping behind the massive wall of armored federal vehicles. Vance shifted the engine into park and turned off the ignition. We sat in silence for a brief moment, watching the chaotic scene unfolding across the muddy pasture. The flashing red and blue lights of the tactical units cut through the morning fog, casting long, eerie shadows over the destroyed remains of my beautiful property. I opened the heavy metal door and stepped out onto the wet grass, my worn leather boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, steady pace of a man who had absolutely nothing left to fear. As I approached the edge of the massive excavation site, the federal agents immediately turned their weapons toward me. But the tall lead agent recognized my face from the classified case file. He quickly raised his hand, signaling his men to lower their rifles and step aside, allowing me to pass through their secure perimeter. I walked right up to the steep, muddy edge of the deep trench and looked down at the absolute disaster below. Bradley was still kneeling in the cold mud, his expensive suit completely ruined, his hands tightly cuffed behind his back. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. He was waiting for me to act like the confused old man he had convinced the court I was. But my eyes were perfectly clear and my posture was straight. I looked down at the exposed titanium casing, gleaming dull and gray under the harsh federal spotlights. That thick metal shell held the greatest secret of my entire life. Exactly 20 years ago, when the world was changing and the government needed a perfectly secure location to bury their most critical infrastructure, they came quietly to my quiet farm. I was a trusted master electrician with a spotless record and a secluded piece of land. I sat in a secure room in Washington and signed a highly classified 99-year lease directly with the United States Department of Defense. I agreed to let them bury the central fiber optic neural network for the entire eastern seaboard military grid, exactly 15 feet beneath my pasture. It was the digital backbone that connected the Pentagon to every major naval base and early warning radar station on the coast. I was sworn to absolute secrecy, generously compensated, and instructed to live my quiet life on the surface as the ultimate cover story. For 2 decades, I grew vegetables and raised chickens directly on top of the most sensitive military communication line in the country. Nobody knew the truth, not even my beloved wife Beatrice or my daughter Maya. And certainly not the arrogant, desperate fool kneeling in the mud right now who thought he was stealing a simple piece of country dirt to build a fake luxury resort. Bradley stared up at me, his jaw trembling uncontrollably as the cold reality of my unbroken mind finally washed over him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out, only a pathetic, ragged gasp for air. I stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at him with an expression of pure absolute calm. I did not raise my voice or show any anger because I had already won the war. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single word penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. "I did not own the dirt down there, son," I explained, my voice echoing clearly over the hum of the federal vehicles. "The Pentagon does. And the classified contract I signed states very clearly that any unauthorized transfer of title or tampering with the soil is a Class A federal felony punishable by decades in a military-grade prison." Bradley violently shook his head, throwing mud across his face. He began crying like a terrified child, frantically stammering that it was a mistake and that he had only forged the papers to save his business. He screamed that I had to tell the federal agents the truth, that I was the one who actually owned the land and that he was just my legal guardian. He begged me to explain to the heavily armed men that he was just a wealthy developer doing a simple commercial excavation job. I smiled, a cold, quiet smile crossing my arms over my chest. I told him he was the one who went to court and officially swore under oath that he was taking full legal control of all my assets. I reminded him that he was the one who aggressively filed the fraudulent deed with the county clerk, proudly putting his own corporate name on the heavily restricted federal land. "You wanted to be the sole owner of this property so badly?" I whispered, looking deep into his terrified eyes. "Well, congratulations, Bradley. You own it now. You own every single piece of the catastrophic sabotage you just committed against the United States government." The tall lead agent stepped forward, grabbing Bradley by the collar of his ruined suit and hauled him roughly to his feet. Bradley thrashed helplessly in the mud, sobbing loudly and begging for mercy. He yelled that he did not know about the military network and that the bank inspector had cleared the soil appraisal. I simply shook my head, watching him completely unravel. I reminded him that the bank specifically warned him about the subterranean easement, and he chose to aggressively bribe an inspector to ignore the federal safety protocols. His own massive greed and endless arrogance had perfectly paved the road to his absolute destruction. There was no escape, and no expensive lawyer could save him from the Department of Defense. He had willingly grabbed a sledgehammer and violently assaulted the most secure communication line in America. He had dug his own grave exactly as I had so carefully planned. The absolute brilliance of the trap was not just in the physical destruction of his fraudulent resort, but in the unbreakable legal chains he had willingly wrapped around his own neck. For months, Bradley had operated under the extreme delusion that stealing my identity and forging my signature on the property deed was his ultimate masterstroke. He believed that transferring the 50 acres into his corporate holding company shielded him from any potential financial fallout. But the justice system has a very rigid way of interpreting fraudulent ownership. By legally forcing his name onto that specific deed, Bradley had completely absorbed every single liability attached to the land. The classified 99-year federal lease explicitly required the registered property owner to guarantee the absolute safety and physical integrity of the subterranean military casing. If I had retained ownership, the federal government would have held me responsible for the devastating excavator damage. But because Bradley had so aggressively fought in family court to strip away my rights and declare himself the sole managing authority, he had legally assumed total responsibility for the massive sabotage. He could not claim ignorance because the original title clearly referenced the restricted underground easement. He could not blame his hired construction crew because he had violently jumped into the trench and personally struck the federal casing with a heavy steel sledgehammer in front of dozens of terrified witnesses. His arrogant desire to dominate my life had perfectly trapped him. He had stolen the ultimate poison chalice. By trying to completely erase my legacy and build a fake empire on my ruined property, he had transformed himself from a standard white-collar criminal into a high-level enemy of the state. He was now facing the full, crushing weight of the absolute highest federal court system. The massive catastrophe was entirely broadcast live across the globe because Bradley had arrogantly refused to turn his camera off before the raid began. The wealthy foreign investors watched in absolute horror as federal tactical agents shoved their brilliant developer face first into the thick mud. Within minutes, the massive international panic rippled through the financial markets. The overseas investors instantly contacted their elite lawyers and immediately froze every single offshore account connected to his fraudulent Ponzi scheme. The $30 million commercial bridge loan he had illegally secured from the Atlanta bank went into immediate and total default the exact second the news of his violent federal arrest hit the public wires. The bank executives watched the terrifying footage and immediately seized all of his remaining corporate assets, completely draining his domestic accounts. Bradley had absolutely $0 left to his name. His elaborate escape plan was instantly destroyed, and his $5 million Cayman Islands fund was entirely blocked by international authorities. He was violently dragged into the back of a black armored federal transport vehicle, completely stripped of his incredible wealth, his fake dignity, and his arrogant freedom. The trap was absolutely complete and fully closed today. The cold, sterile air inside the federal interrogation room smelled of bleach and stale coffee. Bradley sat completely alone at the center of the small space, shivering in his ruined custom-tailored suit. His hands were securely shackled to a heavy steel ring bolted directly into the center of the metal table. The bright fluorescent lights above buzzed with an irritating mechanical hum that drilled straight into his pounding skull. For the past 3 hours, he had been screaming at the heavy steel door, demanding to see his elite corporate defense attorneys. He firmly believed that his massive wealth and powerful connections would swiftly rescue him from this terrifying federal nightmare. He thought a simple phone call to his expensive legal team would instantly secure his immediate release on bail. The heavy metal door finally unlocked with a loud, heavy click and swung open. But it was not a federal agent who walked into the bleak room. It was Harrison, the senior managing partner of the incredibly expensive law firm Bradley kept on a massive monthly retainer. Harrison did not carry his usual leather briefcase, and he did not offer a comforting, reassuring smile. He stood completely rigid near the open doorway, keeping a very safe distance from the muddy, handcuffed man sitting at the table. Bradley immediately began barking frantic, aggressive orders demanding that Harrison file an emergency injunction to sue the government for false arrest. Harrison simply raised his hand, cutting off the desperate, arrogant rant. He looked at Bradley with a cold, completely detached, professional expression and delivered the absolute crushing blow. Harrison stated that his prestigious law firm was officially and immediately dropping Bradley as a client forever. Bradley gasped in absolute shock, demanding to know why his loyal lawyers were suddenly abandoning him in his darkest hour. Harrison flatly explained that the federal government had just executed a massive emergency freeze on every single corporate and personal bank account tied to his name. The $30 million loan had defaulted, and the international investors had legally completely locked his remaining assets. Harrison clearly stated that since Bradley possessed absolutely zero accessible funds to pay their exorbitant hourly legal fees, he was completely on his own. Harrison turned his back on the desperate, screaming developer and walked out of the room, shutting the heavy steel door forever, leaving Bradley totally isolated and totally physically unprotected. Bradley sat in the crushing silence of the interrogation room, staring blankly at the solid metal door. He was completely trapped without any money and without any lawyers to protect him. His entire reality was rapidly collapsing around him in absolute terrible real time. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel door swung open again. This time it was Maya who stepped confidently into the bleak federal room. Bradley looked up, his tired eyes widening in complete, desperate hope. He truly believed his quiet, obedient wife had come to absolutely blindly support him. He foolishly thought she would mortgage their massive mansion to hire a new legal defense team to save his miserable life. But Maya did not look like a frightened suburban housewife anymore. She wore a sharp black suit, and her posture was completely rigid and incredibly strong. She did not rush over to comfort him or offer any sympathetic tears. She walked deliberately toward the cold metal table, carrying a thick, heavy manila envelope in her hands. Bradley frantically begged her to call the bank and immediately transfer funds from her personal checking account to post his bail. Maya completely ignored his pathetic, desperate pleading. She stood tall on the opposite side of the steel table and pulled a thick stack of crisp white legal documents from the large envelope. She slammed the heavy papers down onto the metal surface directly in front of his shackled hands. Bradley stared at the bold, black text printed across the top of the very first page. They were official divorce papers accompanied by a very strict demand for full permanent custody of their 2 young children. Bradley gasped, his mouth hanging completely open in pure, unadulterated shock. He demanded to know exactly what she was doing, loudly insisting that they had to stick together to save their beautiful family. Maya looked him directly in the eyes, her beautiful face radiating an absolutely terrifying coldness. She explicitly told him that their marriage was completely over and that he was absolutely never going to see his children again. Bradley angrily scoffed, leaning forward against his steel restraints. He arrogantly whispered that he had a massive secret escape plan entirely hidden away from the federal government. He smugly boasted that he possessed exactly $5 million secretly stashed in a highly secure private bank account located deep in the Cayman Islands. He foolishly promised Maya that if she helped him quietly escape this federal nightmare, they could easily flee the country and live like absolute royalty on a tropical beach forever. Maya did not even blink at his incredibly ridiculous, cowardly proposal. A slow, victorious smile spread across her face as she leaned slightly closer to his terrified eyes. She calmly informed him that his incredibly secret offshore account was already completely empty. She explicitly revealed that she had successfully hacked his digital tablet and completely uncovered his massive international Ponzi scheme. The federal government has completely seized every penny he ever stole. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of her words finally pierced through his thick, impenetrable shell of infinite arrogance. Bradley sat completely paralyzed in the metal chair, listening to his beautiful wife ruthlessly, completely dismantle his entire criminal existence. He finally understood that he had not outsmarted a single soul. The incredibly elaborate master plan he had so proudly constructed was nothing more than a giant, transparent house of glass. He suddenly realized that his own towering pride had completely blinded him to the incredibly obvious trap that had been meticulously laid directly beneath his expensive leather shoes. I had never actually been the helpless old fool he so arrogantly believed I was. He remembered the quiet, calm way I had completely surrendered my property deed in that cold family courtroom. He vividly remembered how eagerly he had sprinted to the bank to illegally secure that massive $30 million bridge loan using his deeply fraudulent signature. He recalled exactly how proudly he had hired the largest, heaviest mechanical excavators in the entire state of Georgia. He had personally directed those massive steel machines to relentlessly dig straight down into the federal dirt. He had actually grabbed a heavy sledgehammer and violently physically attacked a classified military structure with his own two hands. He had literally eagerly, forcefully dug his own incredibly deep federal grave exactly according to my absolute, precise, unspoken design. A suffocating, terrifying wave of extreme panic completely overtook him. He began violently trembling uncontrollably, his shoulders violently shaking as he stared down at the bold divorce papers resting on the cold steel table. His massive, fraudulent real estate empire was entirely, completely destroyed forever. His secret tropical escape fund was entirely, securely, legally seized by the incredibly ruthless federal government. His incredibly expensive elite lawyers had instantly, permanently abandoned him, leaving him totally, physically, financially unprotected. The terrifying, extremely violent men from the shadow banking cartel would endlessly, relentlessly hunt him down if the federal justice system ever somehow mysteriously let him out of his incredibly dark maximum security cell. Bradley finally completely broke down right there in the incredibly bleak federal interrogation room. He dropped his heavy head down onto the cold, solid metal table and began weeping loudly, uncontrollably, like a terrified, completely helpless young child. He had absolutely nothing left to his completely ruined, deeply pathetic name in the entire massive, unforgiving human universe. Bradley lifted his tear-stained face off the cold metal table, completely shattered and utterly desperate. He looked up at Maya with incredibly bloodshot, completely swollen eyes, profusely begging her for absolutely any tiny shred of mercy. He frantically, practically screamed, demanding that she drive straight back to the ruined farm and aggressively, deeply, loudly beg me to permanently, instantly, completely drop the incredibly severe federal terrorism charges immediately. He loudly, uncontrollably sobbed that I was his own deeply beloved family member and that I simply had to completely, graciously, definitively, permanently forgive him forever. Maya stood completely still, absolutely, totally, entirely, profoundly unimpressed by his incredibly pathetic, totally worthless, loud weeping. She did not offer a single completely sympathetic word or even slightly flinch at his massive, profound, total breakdown. She simply, slowly, deliberately, forcefully, smoothly slid the incredibly thick stack of very crisp white legal divorce papers directly across the cold, hard metal table surface right toward his heavily, tightly shackled, trembling, desperate hands. She looked directly, deeply down into his completely, entirely ruined, pathetic, deeply, truly, permanently broken, dark, extremely terrified, incredibly hopeless, miserable eyes. "Sign the massive papers right now," she demanded with absolute utter finality. The massive heavy steel doors of the federal detention center slammed shut behind me, echoing with a loud hollow boom that signaled absolute finality. I walked slowly down the sterile, brightly lit corridor escorted by a silent, armed guard. The air inside this place was thick and completely devoid of any human warmth, smelling strongly of industrial disinfectant and deep despair. I was wearing my best tailored suit today, a dark navy wool that fit my broad shoulders perfectly. I wanted to look exactly like the strong, capable man I had always been, completely shedding the pathetic disguise I had worn in the family courtroom. The guard led me into a small, dimly lit visitor room partitioned down the exact center by a thick slab of bulletproof glass. There was a cheap black plastic telephone bolted to the wall on either side. The guard checked his heavy silver watch and told me I had exactly 5 minutes before the prisoner was permanently transferred to a maximum security black site awaiting his federal tribunal. I nodded silently and sat down in the cold metal chair, resting my hands calmly on my lap. A heavy metal door on the opposite side of the thick glass buzzed loudly and swung open. 2 heavily armored guards dragged Bradley into the small room. He looked absolutely, completely destroyed. The expensive tailored suits and the smug, arrogant smiles were entirely gone. He was wearing an oversized bright orange prison jumpsuit that hung loosely off his trembling shoulders. His face was deeply bruised and covered in a thick layer of filthy sweat. His perfectly styled hair was a messy, greasy tangle falling over his incredibly terrified, bloodshot eyes. He shuffled awkwardly toward the glass partition restricted by the heavy steel chains wrapped tightly around his waist and ankles. The loud metallic clinking of his shackles filled the quiet room, sounding exactly like the sweet, heavy music of pure, absolute justice. The guards shoved him roughly into the metal chair, forcing him to sit directly across from me. He looked up slowly, peering through the thick, smudge-covered glass. When his wild, desperate eyes finally focused on my calm, perfectly composed face, his entire body began to violently shake. He realized instantly that I was not a broken old man suffering from dementia. I was the sole architect of his total ruin, sitting quietly in my dark suit. Bradley practically lunged at the black plastic telephone bolted to his side of the partition, his chained hands fumbling desperately to knock the receiver off the heavy metal hook. He pressed the phone tightly against his bruised ear and slapped his free hand flat against the bulletproof glass, leaving a greasy, sweaty palm print on the clear surface. I took my time. I slowly reached out and picked up my receiver, bringing it to my ear with absolute calm deliberation. The instant the line connected, Bradley erupted into a hysterical fit of loud sobbing. His voice was a high-pitched, desperate screech stripped of the tone he used to humiliate me. He wept openly, his tears mixing with the grime on his face dripping down onto the bright orange collar of his degrading prison uniform. He began frantically begging me for mercy, his words tumbling out in a rapid, frantic stream of absolute terror. He pleaded with me to immediately call the federal judge and explicitly tell the Department of Defense that the entire massive excavation project was just a terrible, innocent misunderstanding. He cried out that he had absolutely no idea the highly classified military fiber optic neural network was buried under the pasture. He swore aggressively that he was just trying to build a beautiful luxury resort to properly provide for my daughter and his two young, innocent children. He aggressively gripped the plastic telephone receiver tightly, shouting through the thick glass that we were bound by family ties. "You are my family," he screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his incredibly severe federal terrorism charges. He begged me to understand that he had just been incredibly stressed by the extremely demanding pressure of his massive corporate real estate business. He claimed the terrible crushing debt had temporarily clouded his perfect judgment, forcing him to make a few minor, harmless, foolish mistakes. He swore to God that he never actually intended to physically hurt me or permanently steal my beautiful 50-acre property. He sobbed loudly, ignoring the two federal guards standing silently directly behind his metal chair. He aggressively pushed his sweaty, bruised face closer to the thick, bulletproof glass, looking directly into my cold, incredibly calm, dark brown eyes. He choked on his own salty tears loudly, promising to immediately return absolutely every single penny he had ever taken from the foreign investors. He wildly falsely promised to personally completely rebuild my old wooden farmhouse entirely from scratch, using his own two bare hands, if I would just somehow incredibly magically legally save him from spending the rest of his natural miserable life rotting away inside a dark, silent, windowless, maximum security federal military cell. He cried that he simply could not possibly survive inside a brutal, terrifying federal prison because he was a completely refined, educated corporate gentleman who desperately belonged back in high society. He sobbed pathetically loudly, begging for a second chance to prove he could be a good, loyal, respectful son-in-law. He frantically, completely threw away every single remaining shred of his personal dignity, begging me to show him the deep human compassion he had entirely ruthlessly denied me when he illegally froze my bank accounts and violently forced me out onto the cold street. He wept and begged for an unbroken, agonizing 3 minutes while I sat perfectly still, silent, simply watching the total destruction of his massive, fraudulent ego. I let him completely exhaust himself, pouring out his completely worthless, hollow apologies until his ruined throat could no longer physically produce another desperate, panicked sound. When absolute silence finally returned to the small visitation room, I continued looking directly into his swollen, pathetic eyes. The heavy bulletproof glass separating us was completely smeared with his sweat and his tears, but my vision remained entirely crystal clear. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the trembling, cowardly man sitting across from me. My expression was as cold as solid ice, reflecting the absolute severe justice he had brought entirely upon himself. I took a very slow, deep breath, letting the terrible weight of my absolute victory settle firmly between us. Bradley stared back at me desperately, waiting for me to offer him a tiny sliver of hope. Instead, I simply reminded him of the very first night this entire massive nightmare began. I spoke with a voice so incredibly calm and steady that it completely shattered his incredibly fragile remaining sanity. I verbally took him straight back to that lavish, arrogant dinner party where he proudly tried to completely destroy my personal dignity to impress his wealthy investors. I explicitly, clearly reminded him of the incredibly heavy crystal whiskey tumbler he had so violently hurled directly at my boots. "I told you to pour your own drink," I said, my words slicing through the thick silence like a freshly sharpened steel blade. "You could have simply listened to me and poured the scotch yourself. You could have just walked away and kept your massive, fraudulent corporate empire completely intact. But your infinite, blinding, arrogant pride would absolutely not allow you to back down. You deliberately chose to aggressively, violently break that heavy crystal glass on my floor." I leaned slightly closer to the smeared plastic window, ensuring he heard absolutely every single terrible word I spoke. "Now you must sweep it all up." Bradley opened his mouth to release another pathetic, desperate scream, but I did not wait to hear a single syllable of his miserable response. I very calmly removed the heavy black plastic receiver from my ear, cutting off his frantic voice completely. I deliberately placed the phone back onto its solid metal hook, pressing it firmly into place with a loud, definitive click that echoed through the small, cold room. It was the final sound he would ever hear from me for the absolute rest of his natural life. I stood up slowly from the metal chair, smoothing out the wrinkles in my expensive, tailored, dark navy suit. The heavily armored federal guards immediately stepped forward and grabbed Bradley by his trembling shoulders, preparing to drag him deep into the dark, windowless labyrinth of the federal penitentiary system. He violently smashed his face against the bulletproof glass, sobbing hysterically, but I did not even blink. I turned my back on his ruined existence and walked straight toward the heavy steel exit door. I strode proudly down the long, brightly lit, sterile corridor, my head held incredibly high. I walked away from him forever, and I absolutely never once looked back. 6 months have passed since the cold morning when the federal agents took Bradley away in chains. The changing of the seasons brought a much-needed peace to our lives, completely erasing the dark, suffocating cloud that had hung over my family for so long. Bradley is currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary located 1,000 miles away from Georgia. Because his crimes involved the direct sabotage of classified military infrastructure, he was denied any chance of early parole, and his days are spent in absolute rigid isolation. He has no access to luxury, no expensive tailored suits, and absolutely no audience to feed his massive broken ego. Maya finally breathed free. The incredibly messy divorce and the absolute permanent termination of his parental rights were processed with lightning speed by a judge who was absolutely horrified by the massive scale of his financial and federal crimes. With Bradley completely removed from her life, my daughter underwent a truly beautiful transformation. The constant fear and anxiety that used to govern her every single movement completely vanished, leaving behind a strong, independent, and fiercely protective mother. While Bradley's massive fraudulent mansion was immediately seized and liquidated by the federal government to partially repay the foreign investors, I made sure Maya and the children never spent a single night out on the street. I had never actually lost my life savings when Bradley froze my local bank accounts. Those accounts only held my daily operating funds. My true wealth, built from 40 years of hard, honest labor, had always been securely locked away in a private trust that Bradley never even knew existed. I used a portion of those deeply hidden savings to purchase a beautiful, modest 4-bedroom home in a quiet, safe neighborhood, surrounded by towering oak trees and friendly neighbors. It is not a $20 million palace built on lies and stolen money. It is a warm, genuine home built on a solid foundation of absolute truth and unconditional love. Maya spends her weekends baking with her children, and the sound of their pure, innocent laughter completely fills the bright, open rooms. She found a wonderful job working as a manager for a local charity, using her incredibly sharp mind to help people who actually need it. I visit them every single Sunday afternoon, and I sit in their comfortable living room watching my grandchildren play without any fear of a sudden violent outburst. The heavy toxic shadows of the past have been completely replaced by the bright warm light of a truly peaceful future. We survived the absolute worst of the storm completely and entirely intact together. I sit in my favorite armchair sipping hot black coffee and watching the sunlight stream through the wide glass windows. The terrible memories of the locked facility and the freezing rain feel like a distant, fading dream. We are safe now, and we are finally, truly happy forever. The federal government did not just walk away after securing their highly classified infrastructure. The Department of Defense formally apologized for the extreme distress I was forced to endure during the aggressive federal raid on my personal property. Because the original 99-year lease heavily guaranteed the absolute protection of my surface land, they were legally obligated to perfectly repair all the severe damage Bradley had recklessly caused. They compensated me incredibly handsomely for the profound inconvenience depositing a massive untaxed settlement directly into my secure private trust. But they did far more than just write a generous check. Within 2 weeks, a specialized federal engineering team arrived at the farm to completely restore the torn-up earth. They carefully filled in the deep, muddy trench, packed the soil tightly, and smoothed out the ugly, massive scars left behind by the heavy steel excavators. They hauled away the broken, splintered remains of the old farmhouse, leaving the vast, open 50 acres looking absolutely pristine and incredibly quiet once again. I chose not to rebuild the large wooden house. The beautiful memories of my long, happy life with Beatrice were forever safely stored in my heart, and I no longer needed the physical walls to perfectly remember her beautiful smile. Instead, I used a small portion of the generous federal settlement money to build a beautiful, modest wooden gazebo right in the very center of the large green pasture. I spent the early days of spring working entirely with my own 2 hands, slowly, carefully planting a brand new garden dedicated entirely to the beautiful memory of my late wife. I planted dozens of rare blue hydrangeas and wild climbing roses exactly like the ones Bradley had so viciously crushed under the steel tracks. The fresh, dark soil smelled incredibly sweet in the morning dew, and the gentle humming of the honeybees returned to the quiet Georgia farm. Every single afternoon, I drive my old, battered green pickup truck out to the peaceful property. I sit alone under the cool shade of the wooden gazebo, drinking sweet iced tea and watching the vibrant flowers absolutely bloom in the warm, golden sunshine. The land is entirely mine again. The deep, terrible wounds inflicted by greed and pure arrogance have completely healed over, replaced by the quiet, undeniable beauty of natural resilience. My incredibly loyal friend Vance comes out to the quiet farm to visit me on the weekends. We sit together under the peaceful wooden gazebo, playing long, slow games of chess, and talking quietly about the strange, unpredictable, incredibly profound journey of human life. We do not talk about Bradley anymore. The broken, arrogant man rotting away in the dark federal penitentiary is entirely, completely erased from our daily thoughts. His deeply toxic name is absolutely never spoken in my daughter's new warm home, and his memory is slowly, steadily fading away into absolute, total nothingness. Keisha, the incredibly kind, brave young nurse who risked her entire career to hand me that cheap burner phone in the terrible locked facility, is also doing wonderfully today. I used a small portion of my hidden savings to completely anonymously pay off her massive nursing school student loans. She recently sent me a beautiful handwritten card telling me she finally secured a fantastic high-paying job at a highly respected premier city hospital. She no longer has to suffer working endless double shifts in that bleak, deeply depressing state-run facility. I made absolutely sure that the incredibly good people who stood by my side in the absolute darkest moments of my life were generously, quietly, deeply rewarded for their profound human decency. The pacing of my days has slowed down entirely, returning to a deeply satisfying, incredibly beautiful, steady rhythm. I am 74 years old, but I feel incredibly younger and vastly more powerful than I ever have before. The profound, deep satisfaction of absolute total justice has completely restored my personal dignity and firmly anchored my inner peace. I no longer carry the heavy, agonizing burden of watching my only beloved daughter suffer in complete, agonizing silence. I successfully, completely protected my family, my property, and my incredibly proud legacy without ever raising my fists or breaking a single law. The massive storm has completely entirely passed, leaving behind a beautiful, clear, bright, endless blue sky. I look back on the terrifying events of the past year, not with any lingering bitter anger or deep sad regret, but with a profound, incredibly quiet, immense gratitude. The terrible, severe trials we forcefully endured ultimately beautifully revealed the absolute unbreakable core of our immense, incredible strength. The truth had finally ultimately prevailed over the massive darkness, bringing an incredibly warm and lasting comfort to my very soul. The world is a complex place filled with incredibly cruel individuals and profoundly beautiful souls who remind us that goodness will absolutely always incredibly win. We must simply remain completely deeply focused on protecting the innocent people we love the most in this very challenging but ultimately deeply rewarding journey called life. In the end, I learned that true power does not scream for attention, it waits patiently in the dark. Arrogance is a blinding disease that convinces a man he is standing on top of the world right until the moment the earth swallows him whole. Bradley thought my silence that night was the surrender of a weak old man. He did not understand that when a man who built his life with his own bare hands stops talking, he is calculating the exact angle of the strike. Respect is not something you can demand with a thrown glass or a stolen deed. I did not destroy my son-in-law. I simply handed him the shovel and he did the rest. Did you enjoy my story today? Let me know which city you are listening from down in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe to my channel for more incredible stories exactly like this one today.